Every trooper's dream. I honestly can't say how long I was at Camp Forlorn Hope when the Legion took Nelson, or really when I arrived in the Mojave. I lost the date a long time ago, and the days blended together with boredom, danger, and misery. Although, I'm sure it's all on a military record somewhere. Even though I don't know the date, I can tell you about the time I went on leave, which was the best day of my life so far. Notice I said, day. Every trooper, especially every trooper at Forlorn Hope, dreams of their leave. Generally, troopers are given leave based on their pay and time in, for exceptional service, or after periods of strenuous engagement. Considering every trooper at Forlorn Hope was always serving exceptionally, just by being alive in unending strenuous engagement, normal military procedure didn't apply to us. I think the commanders at Hoover Dam or McCarran assumed those of us at Forlorn Hope enjoyed life there because they were always stretched too thin to provide a relief force. Unless a few troopers were killed 100 yards out, then replacements would materialize out of the winds. So, leave at Forlorn Hope was granted based on names in a helmet. Not really, but might as well have been. One day, that dream became a reality for me. During our time off the line, and at an evening muster, we were released for chow. Sergeant Holmes stopped me before I bolted for the chow line, and said, "Harton, it is with great pain for me that I tell you that you have been granted leave effective tomorrow morning at 0800. I think he meant great pain for him because it probably was a great pain to know that I was selected of all people in our platoon. Initially shocked by the statement, my excitement made my mouth speak for me since I couldn't even think what to say. "That's amazing, Sergeant. I wish I knew earlier so I could plan something for it," I said. Apparently I made a mistake by saying that because he instantly said, "Well, since you don't have any plans, I'll ask you to please pick me up a new sidearm and see to bringing back your squad some essentials from the world out there." I thought, perfect. I always wanted to run errands for my sergeant on my one leave, but said, "Sure thing, Sarn." He asked, "Where are you thinking of going?" "Back home, or to New Vegas." No question about that. Anywhere out west I could even think of going was a minimum of 2 to 3 weeks walking. So I said, "New Vegas." He then handed me a large stack of bills and gave me a direct order. "Once you reach New Vegas, use this at the first casino you see named Gomorrah. Place half of this money on red at any table you see playing roulette. Then keep the other half for another task." I don't think Sergeant really understood gambling. Not only was I pretty sure roulette was pronounced roulette, but he didn't even say what to do if he won. Anyway, he went on with the order. "At the casino, find a woman of the evening who goes by, Darling Darla. You may have to ask around a bit, but give her the rest and tell her the following. Holmes never got your last letter, but thinks you have extravagant hair. Can you do that, Harton?" Not even processing his strange request, I was just too excited to leave this darn camp, and said, "Yes, Sergeant." He then handed me extra cash and a note for the sidearm he wanted from someplace near the east gate to the city, and told me that the squad from Forlorn Hope leaves out the Western Trailhead Section 4, precisely at 0800. I was somewhat surprised that none of my buddies in the platoon asked me to grab them things like the sergeant. Instead, when they found out where I was going, they all gave me the stink eye. I couldn't blame them, though. There'd been plenty of people who made a big spectacle about their upcoming leave. Like I mentioned, leave at Forlorn Hope was an extra big deal. Some of the troopers sent to the front from other stations learned that the 3 weeks of leave they saved up during their tour didn't really apply. Here, there'd been plenty of troopers who joined up and got a cushy job protecting some Mojave power station with air conditioning, only to turn into entitled mopers when they got reassigned to a Forlorn Hope infantry company. That's usually when the depression and fatalism sets in. I suppose I was lucky to have been born into the dirt of Forlorn Hope. I didn't know any other kind of military life. None of that mattered that particular evening. I was going to finally check out the big Mojave jewel, New Vegas. I went straight to sleep that evening after chow, but was sure to boast a bit during the designated free time, as is leave tradition. I did the morning muster, yada yada, and grabbed chow when the HQ leave officer asked for me at around 0700. I sprung up from my spot, ignoring the glares from jealous troopers, and reported in with a giddy salute. He rounded up the other 8 troopers from the other companies, destined for leave, and marched us to HQ. We weren't allowed inside the legendary HQ tent, but a tall first lieutenant accounting officer came out with a small chest and asked us how much we wanted to withdraw for our vacations. We lowly troopers didn't get paid in cash like the NCOs did, so every time a trooper was paid, they'd be given an IOU, X amount. Not on leave, though. The people of the wasteland didn't accept official IOUs from the NCR government. So, the LT had a list of us destined for leave with our names and account totals. We approached individually, and the officer would ask, "How much?" I asked myself, how much was a good time in New Vegas? I mentioned that I didn't plan for leave, and none of the leave stories from New Vegas mentioned how much they withdrew from their army accounts. Luckily, some troopers with better plans were in front of me, and one said, "3,000, sir." The officer withdrew 1,500 from the chest and said, "Next." You may notice that 1,500 wasn't what was requested. That was how it was, and that's how each person was handled. The pattern was obvious and easy to manipulate until the person before me. The trooper in front of me stepped up and said to the officer, $894.33, sir. The whole of it, sir. The officer looked at the account and looked back at the trooper with a smirk. The officer said, "That's your entire account." The trooper responded, "I know, sir. Since you half a trooper's request, I'm thinking I can't do much with 400. So, I'd like the whole if you be so kind, sir." The officer apparently took pity on the young PFC because he counted out $894 from the chest. Not having any bit pieces, the trooper didn't seem to care that only 33 bits remained in his entire army account. He walked back to the leave officer, smiling, and muttering gleefully about someone named Dazzle. I then stepped up, was asked the standard question, and decided to splurge. I said the usual amount, 3,000, sir. I was given 1,500, and happily made my way over to the leave officer, who then escorted the leave group to the Section 4 Western Trailhead. It was nearing the 0800 official start of freedom, and the leave officer appointed the highest-ranking leave trooper to command. The leave officer said to us all, "Since you all are going to New Vegas, there is no need for the homebound speech, but you are to all head there together. Take orders from Corporal Pitsley here, and ensure each other's safety. Use your free time wisely, and don't get into trouble. Remember to always use the buddy system to watch each other's backs in town and on the road. Though you are free from active duty, keep in mind that you are all still soldiers of the NCR, and should conduct yourselves as such. Remember the 3 no's of general leave conduct: no drugs, no stealing, and no disgracing the Republic. On duty, or off duty, what you do out there directly reflects what our armed forces here in the Mojave means to the people. Your leave starts now." The officer handed the corporal in charge of the leave group a map for the route to New Vegas, what to do when we got there, where to turn in our weapons before entering the Strip, and a notebook for any reports or incidents. Thank goodness I wasn't in charge of the leave group. If everyone in the team got into trouble, it'd be the corporal's fault for not keeping us in line during our freedom. It still wasn't like the corporal was supposed to order us around. Whoever was in charge of the leave group was just supposed to serve as a rally point, and someone to serve as a senior during any potential road engagements. Either way, we were off, and everyone dropped their military demeanor instantly. Some of the others shouted profanities at the camp, saying, "See ya, forlorn hope. I won't be missing you," amongst other things. Others simply didn't look back, or spent that last minute before heading off to taunt the other mass of troopers stuck in camp. Those guys usually regretted those taunts when returning. I didn't do any of that. I was just too happy, and my mind scrambled about all the things I could do now that I had my week of freedom. I was a tad bummed that I withdrew so much money. Of course, I didn't use cash in the camp, but there was some agency back in NCR that withdrew cash from soldiers' accounts to pay for stuff from catalogs and whatnot. Like, I never had to really buy anything since my remaining pen pals sent me everything I really needed. However, I was saving $1,000 for a special, Kitty's Cat's Paw, issue year 2240, that had my favorite pinup. Being a post-war card service, those, Kitty's Cat's Paws, were expensive, but had great pictures of beautiful women that work or previously worked in New Reno. Knowing the ultra-rare 2240 issue had my favorite girl, Sofia Benedicto Pacifico Juan Maria Ramirez, and her original picture, I had to have it. Though she was an old woman by this time, back in 2240, her card showed her perfectly round and not too big or small. Personality. I only bought those for the interesting profiles on the back. Anyway, after leaving the Section 4 trail and past the patrol stretch, we exited the mountains and onto the stretch of desert leading to the 95. None of us cared about the heat, joking all the while about the miseries of forlorn hope that might as well have been a billion miles away. Everyone was incredibly hyped, detailing what they were going to do, all the stuff they were going to drink, and all the other badness I didn't really plan on. I still didn't know what I was going to do, but during the midday heat in full kit, I was imagining a shower from the Hope Spring. Hearing stories of relaxing pools in New Vegas, I just wanted to get into some water and maybe have a tall glass of cola. The thoughts went on as I imagined more of what I could do. After my dip in the pool and glass of pop, I'd probably put in a decent chaw and go up to one of them fancy rooms I heard about. I might approach the evening with a musical show at that casino called The Tops and see one of those performances described by troopers as just okay. But pretty much anything beat the sound of tired troopers singing Caesar's Ballad or Big Bad Bear. That latter song was awful. There is such thing as, moto. Recalling the faint lights I'd see over the northern cliffs during lonely lights on the observation line, I imagined myself finally walking amongst them. Never being within the neon lights that city was known for, I didn't even know what to imagine. For some reason, I thought I might need sunglasses though. After taking in the sights and action on the streets of New Vegas, I go back to my room for some deep sleep. No worrying the night will be interrupted by, send them out, or pour it on them. No worrying about a psycho Arizonan cutting my throat as I fight consciousness on the 100. No worry about the sun giving me heat stroke while I'm in dreamland, or using a helmet and rolled up undershirt as a pillow. I was gonna pass out on a comfy made bed on the top floor of whatever casino I decided to stay in, and sleep. After reaching the 95, a couple more hours went by as we went north. My dreaming and the enjoyment went on and on well into the day. The sun was almost gone by the time we reached the 188. The place was fairly dead, only a few tents, and the only people were a few dots roaming a perimeter. Beyond the little trade post, the lights of New Vegas were fully on. I spent the night at the 188 on that third day in the Mojave before going to Nelson, but it didn't look anything like what I remembered. Having no frame of reference before the awfulness of forlorn hope, I saw the lights of New Vegas this time in an even more magical way. With the world being too dark to go further, the corporal group leader said we should camp there and head out first thing in the morning. We all agreed, and set out our basic camping gear with eyes fixed on the lights of New Vegas. The corporal said the map showed we weren't too far from the south perimeter to Camp McCarran, and that upon entering the NCR Mojave HQ, we'll take a working train into the city. At that, I was excited to ride in a train, but my thoughts went on when the corporal said we'd be checking into rooms by noon tomorrow if we got up early. No disagreement from the rest of us. Camp all set up, I threw my head onto my dirt and helmet pillow, passing out with thoughts of the pool, that cola, and that bed. That was my one and only day of leave. When morning came, some of the leave troopers were packing up, and I instantly did the same. Spirits were unbelievably high as the sun peeked over the east, knowing that our dreams of heaven were going to be realized in only a few short hours. As the trading post came to life in the dawn, some of us grabbed a bite to eat at a little slop shop by the overpass. The whole leave crew was still laughing and joking, and I noticed a patrol of troopers come in from the New Vegas direction. Minutes later, we were all done, and another group came in from the south, popping a squat at one of the other picnic tables. Both of the groups were sour-faced and grumbling for some reason, and one of the fellas in the leave crew shouted at the table, "What's got you down, fellas? The sun ain't even hit yet. Y'all still wishing for a nuclear winter." Everyone on the leave crew joined in on the laugh, and one of the grumblers shouted back, "Why so cheery, Trooper Tom?" Trooper Tom, though that wasn't his name, shouted back, "We're going on leave, effing New Vegas, baby." I cheered at that with the rest of Leave Group. The same sour trooper at the other table stood up and shouted towards a tent with an NCR flag waving out front. "Heyo, Sarnt Tinkin, you got a radio in there." A large power-armored man with bear insignias all over it slowly approached and stood between the two tables. "Sarnt Tinkan?" asked the trooper. "Yes, we have a radio." "Why?" The trooper asked in a smug way. "What was that word from McCarran?" The metal outpost soldier said. "McCarran got radio from Forlorn about raids along the southern patrol route. Camp Golf got confirmation with Searchlight's North reports as well, and now the roads are closed." "And that means?" asked the formerly glum, but now smug trooper. Metal man responded. "That means lockdown for the whole Colorado sector." "Why?" None of us said anything. Everyone in the Leave Group knew what that meant. All patrols were ordered to the nearest NCR installation or outpost for lockdown until further notice. Our leave was over, and we were stuck at the 188 with 2 patrols who took shelter there after hearing the order. Then, we were the target of the laughing and joking. Nobody in our group laughed. The corporal slammed his fist through the picnic table, startling a woman in a hideous robe at another table. And I swore out loud for the 2nd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 8th, and all the way up to the 1,000th time in my life. Dealing with tragedy. They say that denial is the first stage of dealing with any tragedy, and I'm inclined to agree. The patrols that entered the trade post after the lockdown soon shut their stupid mouths when they learned that our leave was from Forlorn Hope. After that, they just felt sorry and apologized, but their apologies didn't resume the leave. Worthless. Officially in that denial stage, our group collectively thought, it's delayed, so what? In an hour, we'll be heading out to continue our vacation. Then, the first hour went by and we thought, okay, next hour. And it went on like that until the day was nearly over. No word from the radio at the 188 outpost. Night was soon upon us, and that was when the anger stage really set in. The caravan traffic was almost dead as the city was alight in the distance, mocking us. The 2 other patrols merged with our group, and we made a big fire where we collectively hated the world. One patrol group was doing a midnight run south of McCarran when the order was called, and 188 was the closest outpost. The other patrol was from Helios, and would have rather been there instead of this dumpy little rest stop for caravans. But none of them were as hate-filled as our leave group. I knew with 100% certainty that this lockdown was because of me getting selected for leave. Though I had zero proof, I knew for an absolute fact that Sergeant Holmes, or Corporal Jason, or any of my so-called friends couldn't stand the fact that I got to go on leave. The whole camp collaborated to falsely shut down the roads, because they knew that I was given a vacation. I wasn't alone in thinking this way. Every other member of the leave group admitted every order they ever subverted as a reason why this happened. The 3rd morning came, and every trooper still held only a little bit of hope that the all-clear order would be given at any moment. The anger was vented in the night, but that morning was when the next stage came. Bargaining. Most of us spent our time around the outpost tent with the radio and home of the power armor troopers, waiting. The leave corporal shouted to anyone who would listen, "This is an outrage. They can't do this to us. It violates the New Vegas Treaty." I heard about that before. That was some treaty signed with that Mr. House fella who was supposedly the head honcho of New Vegas. The part of the treaty the corporal was referring to was the fact that the treaty stated how the NCR wouldn't obstruct the ability of troopers to go there on leave. I suppose it didn't account for the fact that leave can be canceled at the drop of a hat when sector lockdown orders were given. One of the patrol troopers backed up the statement, and then the corporal brought out his inner lawyer by announcing to the whole outpost, "The very act of canceling our leave en route to New Vegas is itself a restriction of our access to the city, lockdown or not, and therefore a violation of the treaty." There was more "look how right I am" talk, until one of the metal troopers had seemingly been waiting for this very conversation. The armored trooper sergeant pulled a paper, pen, and envelope out of nowhere, then slapped them down in front of the corporal. The metal trooper said, "Go ahead, Corporal. Go and write down your grievance to Mr. House. Tell him or it, or whatever he is, how unfair the army is by canceling your days of hookers and alcohol. I know House doesn't even talk to our ambassador. but I'm sure he sets that time aside for reading the letters of pissy troopers. More arguing and more bargaining about what was owed to us commenced. If we got the all clear that third day, even in the night, we could still have a decent day or two in New Vegas before having to report back in at Forlorn Hope. We all knew in our hearts that wouldn't happen. So, I and a few others bargained with something else. Sitting on a rock near the 188 Army tent, I looked to the sky. Starfather, great hub, sole redeemer of the unworthy rim meat. I picked up a thing or two at my mandatory hubologist meetings. If you end this lockdown and let me enjoy this leave period, I swear I'll be the most devout hubologist since Alphonsoy the Rocketeer from Battlefield Quetzal 6, the moon worm of Malsulzak. I don't think the great hub much cared for me because the outpost radio got a transmission from Forlorn Hope asking for the leave commander. And it wasn't good news. The corporal got on the radio and checked in with the comms officer. For starters, they were making sure we didn't sneak off to New Vegas anyway. Then they gave word about an incoming crew that was going to need our help with the supply list. That confirmed it. Our leave was officially done for, and now a crew was coming to give us orders and whatnot. Then came the depression stage. Visions of that pool, that cold drink, and that soft bed vanished in the blink of an eye, and I almost wanted to cry. Weeks or months, or however long I was at Hope under fire, crawling through dirt, or recovering the mutilated dead couldn't make me cry, but I wanted to at that moment. Some of the leave troopers considered desertion or doing themselves in, but knew better. Deserting or killing yourself weren't authorized actions in the NCR Army. All the while, the other stuck patrol troopers looked at us like puppies that had just been gutted. The outpost got more lively as the caravan traffic passed by in the day. Then, at some time in the later afternoon, the peak of our sadness hit when we saw the brown uniforms coming up from the south tugging along multiple Brahmin. When they showed up, us leave troopers reported in with them, and that was when our depression finally turned into the last stage, acceptance. I had all but forgotten that these troopers sent to us were from the front as well. When the leave corporal asked what cargo they needed help with, and how long before heading back, the trooper in charge of the supply train, an exhausted-looking sergeant said, "Don't know. My crew and I have special clearance during this sector lockdown, and I'm milking this for all I can." The supply train had no intentions on rushing to get back, and the sergeant seemed certain of caravan delays for some of the items on his list. Although I didn't get to experience New Vegas on leave, and I was technically back on active duty, the whole leave group got to enjoy their leave at the 188. And away from the strict discipline and danger of frontline life, our acceptance stage was making do with our hand that didn't turn out as bad as others, but certainly not as good as the alternative. 188 Trading Post. Given the lackadaisical supply sergeant with no rush to return back to Forlorn Hope, us leave troopers were given the freedom to continue our leave at the lockdown 188. It again wasn't New Vegas, but the supply sergeant and his boys got most of the things on their list in only a few hours. As night soon fell, another big fire was made with the patrol groups, and we all had a good old time. It was there that I really realized some of the troopers from those trapped patrol groups were female. I'd almost forgot that the NCR Army had women in it, being at Forlorn Hope for so long. I was also too busy boo-hooing about the leave thing to notice them before. Some of those gals told the best jokes and added unique sounds to the songs and bits to the conversations. Taking off their helmets, some were very pretty with long hair hidden by a bun and sweet faces that made the combat-aged Forlorn Hope boys look like utter garbage. Some women had very short hair with fun-loving but hardened personalities from time in the desert and minds on practicality. The gals of the patrol groups differed in all means of physical appearance, but it was hard to get too attracted to some of them due to the thick brown dust jackets and bulky leather chest armor. That didn't matter to some of the leaf fellas, though. Either way, the night of acceptance was fun, and I made a new friend with a petite little thing from Junktown, PFC Elisa Markovich. Another morning came. The lockdown was still in effect, and I started feeling like I was spending too much time with the other troopers. As much as I enjoyed the company of my fellow buds in brown, one thing I was looking forward to about leave was meeting other people. For example, who was that woman in the hideous robe who was here nearly every other day? I guess my intrigue was noticed because that morning after the supply boys arrived, I was sitting with some of the troopers at the picnic table when the smug little trooper Elisa said, "You gonna chat her up, Ed? Or just keep staring? Haha." I wasn't attracted to that gal in the robes by any means, probably because of the robes, and said it how I didn't know what to say. One of the troopers in my leave group said, "Go ask why she's wearing that getup, haha." The others laughed, and I did too. That was a good conversation starter. Maybe. I then tried making more excuses, but caved when one of the other leave troopers accused me of not being over my boyfriend, pen pal. I forgot I mentioned my pen pals to the leave troopers. I did the breaking up and let him down easy. And I'm straight, is what I was going to say. But instead I got up and approached the woman sitting at the distant bench. Sitting down opposite the woman in those gross-looking green robes, she didn't look up from her plate. The sun was just over the mountains when I got a real good look at the unique clothing. Weirdly entranced by the pattern of the fibers, I had never seen a garment like that before. It looked like a dark green burlap hoodie with thick layers. I think she felt my stare because eventually she glanced up, showing a decent-looking pale face. She still wasn't really my type. The catalog with Sofia Benedicto Pacifico Juan Maria Ramirez was my type. As soon as she caught my eyes, she asked in a way I couldn't figure, "Can I help you, proud trooper of the Republic?" Not expecting the latter part of the introduction, I thought I heard sarcasm, but it also seemed pretty genuine. My mouth asked the first thing that came to mind. "Why are you wearing that outfit? It's really interesting." Her eyebrows furrowed, and she seemingly stared through me. "Why are you wearing that thick brown jacket? It'll be hot later. Might get heat stroke." I didn't know what this woman would say on approach or in response, but what I imagined certainly wasn't that. I then said reflexively, but surprisingly wittily, "Sounds like a good idea. Passing out saves the hassle of walking anywhere. Your turn." Her face just showed the hint of laughter before she caught it and returned to that gaze. She responded, "Fair enough. I like this outfit. Keeps the sun off my back and I can deal with the heat. Good enough." I shrugged. Okay, then that was it. I didn't much care for this gal's attitude. I saw the troopers at the table giving thumbs up, but then I looked back. I was drawing a blank. I had nothing more to say to this woman, and so I stood up with a, "See ya." I stood up, about to swing my legs over and walk back to the more enjoyable company, but the woman said, "Wait." I stopped, and she added, "Was that it?" Then I turned back to her and said, "Think so. You seem like a mean person." I like when people are nice. That was a pretty childish sounding thing to say coming from a grown man, and perhaps she felt I was rather simple because she dropped her shoulders and said, "Come on, sit back down." I sat back in the same spot as she said, "I'm not a mean person." "All right then. That's good," I said. She seemingly extended an olive branch by asking in a nicer tone, "What are you doing here?" "I've seen you and your pals whenever I've been here recently," I said. I was going to the big city, but our leave got canceled by a lockdown. All troopers' leaves on this stretch of road got canceled, and patrols had to return to the nearest outpost. I waited for her to say something as she looked longingly out somewhere. Just as I was about to ask what brought her to the 188 so often, she said rather solemnly, "I know how bad lockdowns can be." "You were in the NCR Army. That's awesome. When did you get out?" I asked more giddily than even I expected. For the faintest second she looked perplexed, but answered immediately, Yep. Only for a few years though. Got out not too long ago." It was cool to be talking to a veteran, so I enthusiastically said, "That's great. Did you serve in the Mojave?" "Me and my fellas are from Forlorn Hope." Answer all lined up. The woman grinned in a way I couldn't quite figure and said, "I did. I was part of the 16th Logistics Battalion, Bravo Company." Wow. I never even heard of that unit, but then again, I didn't know every unit in the military. She seemed astonished by my expression, and I asked, "Was it pretty dangerous? Were you in the Mojave during Hoover Dam?" The young woman again seemed amused by me, probably from talking to another proud trooper after her time. She said, "Yes, it was dangerous. But no, I got out a while before that. We were supporting the boys surrounding Helios 1 while they gave those Brotherhood of Steel bastards the what for. At that, I felt a little odd. I mean, I lived nearly my whole life in San Fran, and the Brotherhood had an outpost there. They always seemed pretty decent with the she, and largely kept to themselves. I recalled how strange I felt when marching to the Mojave and having to keep eyes out for Brotherhood ambushes. Her enthusiastic face changed when I said dryly, Brotherhood was always sorta strange. Her face fell to a curious one as she asked, you had run-ins with the Brotherhood. I didn't want to upset this vet and her triumphs against them, but I was honest. Sorta. I'm originally from San Fran. Brotherhood's got a base or something near Chinatown where I grew up. They'd always been okay with us. But they must have done some bad stuff to piss off the big bear. She was silent for a long moment. Perhaps my personal experience with those techie fellas crossed a line for this vet, who probably lost a lot of friends to them. The silence went on for a while longer before she surprisingly understood. Brotherhood's got a lot of people killed, but I think they're just folks stuck in their ways. I didn't know too much about them, and said as much. I only grew up near them. I don't know nothing about their ways. They just always been neutral to us in San Fran, so we've been neutral right back. I was starting to sound like my mama and pop. She caught my eyes and asked, well, what made you join the NCR Army? I said in proud but vague defiance of my prior utterance, because I ain't neutral to bad folks. She asked intriguingly, what do you mean? Mama and Pop heard about the Legion back home, and said it's all NCR lies. I've been at Forlorn Hope almost my whole tour, and it ain't lies, unless my eyes were tricking me. I seen how awful those filthy people are. I was starting to get worked up about all that back at Forlorn Hope. I thought again about people like Mama and Pop not taking sides just because they want to spend their whole lives fishing, trading, gardening, or cooking supper. If I learned anything in the Army, it's that if you ain't on one of the lines, that means you're in no man's. You're barbed wire, you're a shell hole, or you're just one of those bodies lying in the sun when those morons in red come running over. I didn't want to get worked up in front of this vet of Brotherhood and NCR conflicts. So, I stopped when I caught her face locked in deep concentration. I exhaled just a tad and apologized. I'm sorry. Didn't mean to get worked up. She threw her shoulders up and said calmly, I totally feel you. And you definitely seem to believe and understand why you're here. I wasn't sure I understood why I was in the Army at all. But I said, thanks. My whole tour was probably nothing compared to what you went through against those Brotherhood fellas, and I gestured for her name. Just call me Santangelo. I was going to ask what rank she went by when she was in the Army, and she added, Tech Sergeant. I realized it was about time to go and said, well, it was great talking to you, Tech Sergeant Santangelo. Thanks for your service. She smiled. You too, and did the gesture. I responded with a smile as well, and pridefully gave her my official NCR name, Edward Harton, Private First Class. I made my way back to the table with my trooper pals, and they asked all about her deal. I told them that she was a vet from the big Helios 1 battle back in the day, and one of the patrol troopers from that station got excited. By the time I got to that part, the Helios trooper was about to head over and meet the former Tech Sergeant Santangelo, but she was gone from the table. It was almost like she vanished. I was sure she'd be by again in another day or two like before. There at the table, I learned that there was some other vet at the trade post as well. Set up by a destroyed Army truck from long ago, was an arms merchant whom some of the guys from McCarran knew. They mentioned that she was dishonorably discharged after refusing to properly discipline some of the troopers who got in trouble. I thought that was a bit over the top considering at Forlorn that would have been likely a CDL2 or possibly 3. Perhaps she had prior incidents. Apparently, the arms merchant was pretty connected and held no grudge towards NCR since the supply sergeant got most of the ammunition order filled from her alone. Later on, I asked the supply sergeant about when our group was headed back, considering the supply train was exempt from the lockdown. He said he was just waiting on a supply of shotguns from those gun runner fellas who supplied most of the Army's weapons. Not sure if that was just a stall. He said it actually wasn't, and that it'd arrive in a couple days. I asked the sergeant about why the camp needed shotguns, and he informed me that the Army was lacking replacement parts for many of the service rifles in camp. The order was too big for the government back home to fill in the time needed. So, many of our guys were getting old scatterguns in the meantime. Both of us knew those wouldn't fare too well on the observation line, so neither of us knew what to make of that. The next morning of that working vacation came, and I wandered around the outpost. Up top, there wasn't more than the arms merchant, the little grub stop, and that army tent for the heavy boys. Lockdown was still going, and I was getting stir-crazy from the monotony. I headed down below, and to my surprise, there were a few more occupants to the post. I came across a mean guy and his buddy, whom upon asking who they were, said, "Gun runners." I figured there was a gun runner person at the outpost who took the order for the supply sergeant. It was unfortunate that I asked if they had any guns in stock, because when they said, yes, I was reminded of the errand Sergeant Holmes ordered me to conduct on my leave. I found a much better quality 9mm pistol than those busted pieces of trash back at camp. I paid for it with the stash that Sergeant Holmes gave me, but the thing was too pricey. I tried bartering, but no dice. I paid the cash Sergeant gave me, and had to dip $109 of my own cash, leaving alone what was set aside for Darling Darla. There still wasn't much under the overpass, only a poor child with a piece of strange headgear who offered to tell my fortune in exchange for something I owned. I tried to give him some cash, but he said he only took objects that were personal. What a charlatan. I caved, gave him the steel can of Billy's Big League Cha I kept as my first can. I suppose I wasn't all that shocked when my personal energy connected to the can made the boy say, "Black gums, mead for more, survive the sun, and fade into the arms of sleep with crooked jaw." The kid then winced in pain and I felt ripped off. At least I wasn't going to die of heat stroke or a legionary's machete, but would of mouth cancer. Anyway, after that gloomy talk, I walked away to enjoy the rest of the time with more enjoyable company, the sad and stressed troopers of war-torn desert. In the afternoon of that very same day, something in the distance caught my eye. Coming in from the east, on the road from the Boulder City ruins, was a train of figures. I wondered what it was until it got close enough. Who arrived was a group of 15 or so rangers, most of whom were in that yellowish or tan combat armor with the neat hats, and only one was in the familiar dust coat and gas helmet I was used to seeing. The leader conversed with the outpost heavy guards, and then the whole group of rangers headed south. They didn't stop for questions from the supply sergeant as they continued to march by. All the caravan traffic stopped to look at those roughed-up NCR elites, and we did too. There were maybe 10 rangers at Forlorn Hope altogether, keeping watch in the towers, or waiting till their shift, but nothing like that. I later learned that the lockdown initiated by activity west of No Man's Land had moved south towards another big NCR camp, Camp Searchlight. The rangers were brought in from Hoover Dam, and headed to intercept the raids or man the hotspots already secured by those from Searchlight and Helios. An hour later, the outpost radio told the metal troopers that the Colorado sector lockdown was lifted because of the adequate reinforcements that command rallied for the situation. Finally, with that, everyone stuck at the 188 was free to go, but the supply sergeant we were now under still had to await that shipment of shotguns. As the patrol from Helios and the one from McCarran geared up to head out, I kept thinking, that would have been the day our leave group had to check out of our hotel rooms and start heading back on the line. As the patrol troopers left, our group from Forlorn Hope said goodbye, and they were especially mournful to us in the leave group. I gave the little Elisa a goodbye, and she gave me her address and unit. At least I got a nice new pen pal out of the experience. The remainder of us were still awaiting that shipment, and hoping it took the rest of our enlistments. Sure enough, it was dusk, and about 3 hours after the patrols left when we saw the train coming in from the north. 3 Brahmin, escorted by 5 or 6 guys, passed by the merchants going towards New Vegas. The outpost was closing up for the evening, and the train arrived just in time to show who it was. The gun runners unloaded 6 long crates, each one with 5 shotguns crammed inside, and multiple ammo boxes full of shells. The lockdown was over, and now there were no more excuses for not returning, except one. It was too dark out. The sergeant and we troopers staged the gear, and were told that we'd stay the night at 188 and head straight back in the morning. Despite my desperate prayers to the god of the religion I ironically joined, morning came. You, the reader, may be wondering why the leave group didn't just resume our leave after the lockdown. The leave papers we all carried specifically said the date we had to check back in with a heading, no exceptions. That morning was that date. Still under orders from the supply sergeant, we loaded up the shotguns, ammo, and other camp essentials on the already burdened Brahmin, and began heading south before the sun was even up. More walking, more hating the world, and more internal dread. Hours passed, we went east, through the trails and narrow canyons, and arrived back at the same near-dead camp. The only difference being more shell holes closer to the trailhead, more injured troops in medical, and instead of glares at the returning leave troopers, there was laughter. That's what you get for being randomly selected for 7 days of joy and rest, is what the mocking troopers might as well have said. The supply sergeant and his guys were spared the mocking, and us leave troopers reported back in with our prospective commands. I gave Sergeant Holmes the pistol I had to get him, told him how much it cost out of my pocket, and he actually reimbursed me. I handed over the orders from that leave officer, and asked if I'd get to resume the leave next month due to the unforeseen events. No. I was back, joining in my company's section of their week off the line, and back with a plate of chow and my buddies. After the short period of mockery, my pals in brown really did feel for me and the other leave troops. Though I was deprived of the lights and comforts of that city, I was surrounded by pals who really did care, even if they were a little hard at first. Raid squads. After the first few days of the normal camp routine, I quickly forgot about the leave that never was. Troopers with less than operable weapons were given those shotguns we picked up. I had always taken great care of my service rifle, even during crawls in the dirt to the 100 line. Nights interrupted by gunfire were the usual, and I was told that the Legion really did try a few daring raids while I was gone. One of the 100-yard lines was wiped out, and a Legion wave nearly made it to the trailhead in one attack. After that, the winding path down to no man's land was mined even more, and more troopers were posted at the top around the clock. After that particularly bad incident while I was away, Command had finally had enough with the 100-yard squad and officially disbanded it, only to be replaced by another dangerous job/punishment. Even though the big brass of the Mojave still denied any offensive moves, our commanders installed a workaround with raid squads, or the job of assaulting sand. When a company is on the observation line, they are still relatively safe from most of the dangerous jobs, unless they got in trouble. However, the two companies off the line were reduced to one. One company was specially designated as a reserve company, and they were in charge of taking any action if the line, or raid squad, a patrol, or observation station sees action no matter the time. When a trooper's patrol sees a Legion raid party leaving out the western cliffs, they are to pin them down if possible, while an alert trooper rallies a squad or two from the reserve company for aggressive action. Where the raid squads come in is during the evening. The 100-yard line was used as a defensive force to counter any Legion night raids in no man's land before they could even reach the winding path. It seems that the command forgot that our enemy is best at offense because the yard line was a thing for far too long. The raid squads took a better yet more dangerous approach. Probably the only reason Forlorn Hope hadn't been overwhelmed by this point was because it was seated in a perfect rocky area. In order to even reach the trailhead, a legionary had to maneuver through over a mile of no man's land laden with our barbed wire, through the gunfire on the observation line, and up the half-mile winding trail just to reach the trailhead guards and camp proper over 400 feet above no man's land. The steep cliffs down to the Colorado made attacks from the east impossible, and the patrols through the western cliffs had that approach completely locked down. Finally, the north of us had that ranger station, and north of that was troopers and patrols spread along a line to the final crossing at Hoover Dam. The only true Legion approach was from the south, and we had that under firm but battered control. In order to counter the Legion's incessant attacks was to put us on the attack. The new raid squads were again full of punished troopers and conscripts, but they had a simple task. I knew what it was like out there personally, because although I wasn't punished again, I would eventually volunteer. When a raid squad goes out into no man's, They are specifically ordered to dirty themselves up. Basically, a trooper will roll himself in the sand, cover his face with dirt or old brown boot polish that we didn't have any other use for, goggle up, and grab a rifle before heading down. Once the weaponry really became a problem, I'd later be assigned a shotgun, but more on that later. As night fell, the raid team would take positions spread thin across the no man's and fire sporadically. 1 to 3 shots from each trooper every 30 minutes, all at different intervals. The dust and face paint was to better blend into the sands, or better conceal if a flare was shot. And the continuous shot or two every few minutes was to indeed let the Legion know that we were out there and ready. Each hour, the raid squad would advance a bit further into the no man's, so the Legion would feel like an attack was imminent. By around 0200, the raid squad would practically be on top of the Legion's watch posts around the cliff passes to Nelson. Continuing the charade of an actual attack, the occasional thunder of a grenade explosion rocked the night. The fragile and dangerous element of these nightly fake attacks came from balancing the amount of pressure with the possible response. Where that term, assaulting sand, comes from was the fact that we were essentially raiding nothing. The troopers out there spend the whole night shooting at nothing as they advance under the darkness, keeping the Legion always waiting for the real deal. But, like I mentioned above, the balance was sometimes thrown off, and the raid squads were no longer just shooting at the dirt. More on that shortly. So, I wasn't there for the first raid squad, but when the first one went out, we saw the same result as the first night of the 100-yard line, total success. The Legion didn't even know what to do at the peak of that first attack. NCR had never attacked Nelson directly since Forlorn Hope became the front. The Legion sentries fortified around Nelson had to awaken their commanders from their sweet dreams about murder and savagery, only to find out they were being, quote, attacked. As the raid squad receded into the night, the Legion was left confused. Although, it wasn't long before the Legion wised up and adapted, as they tend to do in their own brutal way. The crackle of gunfire throughout the nights became a regular thing, and I was no longer awoken by that, unless it was 2 feet away and preceded by a send 'em out. But I mentioned the fragile nature of the raid squad's 0200 finales, because as the Legion got used to the nightly fake assaults, they measured each situation. They seemed to be on edge, not knowing if this night or the next will be the real attempt to take back Nelson. So, a few rapid, accurate gunfire crackles, and maybe a grenade or two would be enough to keep them down. Any more than that, and there would be problems. I was on night guard at the observation line one night shortly after returning from leave when the raid squad was a bit too ambitious. I saw my watch, courtesy of Stacy the follower, show it was around 0200 and I awaited the climax before the tactical retreat. The usual volley of gunfire went off. One grenade boomed in the distance, then another, and then another. Almost a full minute of gunfire, and nearly 6 grenades went off, which is a long time if you think about it. Looking at the ranger in the western tower, I was waiting for some kind of news or order to be passed by the other night sentries, but the gunfire stopped. I figured the raid squad met with a Legion night raid, but no, not yet. 30 seconds of silence after the 0200 symphony passed before another uproar. Instantly, the ranger with his night vision saw something, shouted something over the distant rumble, 1 flare shot from the western tower, and then 1 flare shot from the Colorado tower. A trooper on the trailhead waved his order flag in the moonlight and shouted something down at the first trooper of the night guard. Another shout from that guy, and troopers on the western end of the line began firing south. The shout must have been send 'em out, because I caught glimpse of troopers throw themselves out of dreamland as I reflexively slammed my rifle onto the line and started my 1/2 mag. Soldiers, startled by the sudden gunshots around them, joined the volley like so many other nights. I fired nearly half of my half magazine as the flares lit the no man's land. The raid team was still too far, and I wasn't sure if our rifles even had the range to do damage that far out. No telling who was who. The last of the observation line finished their magazines and asked each other what was happening while the dust settled and the flare-contrasted landscape became clearer. The dots in the distance began to collect themselves, but I saw 4 dots approaching. It became clear that the 4 dots approaching us were our guys, and that speculation was solidified by the Ranger Tower shouting, "Hold fire!" The flares were nearly dead in the middle of no man's land as we watched. Another flare was shot and popped over no man's, followed by another one 30 seconds later. The figures approaching were our guys all right, and they used the brightness of the gently falling flares to maneuver through the barbed wire. The real puzzling thing to all of us was why the gaggle of legionaries still remained at the far end of no man's land. Any other event like that would have been immediately seized to counter-raid us, especially based on the size of that Legion response force. As the remaining troopers from the raid squad reached the bottom of the winding trail, most of us were still fixed on the congregated mass of legionaries standing motionless. The last flare was about to die again in the center of no man's when a trooper down the line said, "Must have been New Mexican Legios." The enemy we fight. I'd always heard of other types of legionaries, but never considered or noticed any difference. All the waves of red-clad crazies that hit us in the night, or in the sandstorms, seemed the same. The trooper who made that remark on the line about New Mexican Legios was a replacement from Searchlight, though I had only one legitimate experience with legionaries that wasn't in a truly dangerous context. The trooper from Searchlight claimed familiarity with different types of legionaries, the types a lot of us were at least somewhat familiar with. That guy from Camp Searchlight had a few run-ins with the Legion himself, and after the survivors from that raid squad were escorted to the dock, the rest of us watched that still motionless mass at the south end of no man's. The line was fully awake in this moment, and everyone waited for another, send 'em out, order, or even a board on 'em, when or if they advanced. The mass of legionaries never moved for a solid 15 minutes, until finally they started to disperse and trickle back towards Nelson. Once that happened, the dayboys went back to sleep, and dawn was not too far away. Hearing that trooper's words in the silence after the "send 'em out" order, me and some of the other night fellas started talking with him. Camp Searchlight was far south, and acted as the eastern front due to a Legion crossing point at a place on the Colorado called Cottonwood Cove. Though the boys over there didn't have much luck with captives either. The trooper gave tale of a slave who collapsed on their perimeter maybe a year prior. A slave with much knowledge. The slave claimed to have been one for about 13 years, and spent her entire time looking for an escape. That seemed like real dedication to me. Hearing that made me wonder at what point a person under harsh circumstances simply comes to terms and accepts the situation. Either way, the slave was from New Mexico, well familiar with the Legion, and even did work in a library in the Legion's capital of Flagstaff out in Arizona. In recovery, the slave's knowledge came out, and NCR quickly put her under protection. Much of what the military knows about the Legion, if not from the desert rangers who'd been fighting them long before Hoover Dam, or the occasional storied rumor from out east, was from that slave who ran away over a year ago, and before I was even in the army, I think. That trooper on the line helped Searchlight's dock in watching over the runaway slave, and word about who was what in the Legion spread to the common troopers from all over through the odd letter to a friend, or change in duty station. Apparently, despite my interactions with those Legion prisoners, the creature that killed Dawn, and even some of my other less noteworthy experiences with a Legion raid, the folks in Nelson are people too. Different in some ways, same in others. You look around any camp of NCR troopers back in NCR, or out in the Mojave, and you may not immediately see the difference. However, if you look closely, you can see who is what, and the diverse culture of our own NCR military shows in different ways. One type of trooper you may see will be one from the hub. Being from one of the first post-war cities that was built on trade, troopers from there will usually be toughened from life in the streets, and know how to sell you whatever. I've often been thought of as a hub trooper, because of my propensity to acquire things for people through my pen pals, and by the fact that our company was originally part of a home guard regiment and hub battalion. Then again, when they hear me refuse to curse, or have no response to hub-related jargon, they're left confused. Usually, the most lively troopers, if they don't live for the Republic, they'll live just to go home with enough savings to have something when they get back. Despite that, hub troopers are usually the worst when it comes to saving money. I believe the guy on my leave group with only $800 in his entire military account was one such hub trooper. A common trooper in any unit is one from a place called the Los Angeles, LA Boneyard, or just Boneyard. Even though there were two real types of typical Boneyard troopers, my follower pen pal was from there, the one who worked at a university. The university is one of the big attractions in that town, and that led to one type of boneyard trooper. That being, one who spent his childhood in their library and thinks he's too smart for the infantry. That know-it-all wasn't smart enough to join the followers of the apocalypse to avoid the draft, though. That kind of trooper was usually shut up by his brother from the boneyard, the street-tough industrial worker, or gun-runner patriot. Apparently, the town was pretty known for having lots of industry alongside the university, and that created strong people. One of those industries was firearms, led by the Gunrunners Company, who supplied the NCR military's weapons. Working close with the NCR military, some Gunrunners employees felt it was their duty to join the military, but kept a better grip on reality than those troopers from Shady Sands. A lot can be presumed about any group of people, and judgments should always be determined after figuring out individual character. However, 8 out of 10 troopers from Shady Sands dreamed much bigger than they could deal with. Shady Sands being the capital NCR, it's no wonder that they have some of the most patriotic troopers. Troopers from there join up with stars in their eyes and dreams in their heart, only to wonder where their senator father is when the load on their back is too heavy. Their Dayglow trash sergeant was too mean to them, or when faced with a dangerous assignment. Many shady troopers, though not all, grew up without a worry until faced with the Mojave heat, or some blood-covered creep in sports pads and a skirt. Though that created the most cowardly, or fatalist troopers, I've seen many officers who got their position from a connected parent act very brave under fire. First Platoon's old LT before dying on a recovery team was one such officer. Another trooper you might run across is a Reading trooper. That title was given to a lot of down-home country fellas regardless if they're from Reading itself. That town was a mining town for a long time, but after some incident, it became a giant ranching one. The tough people who come from that town on the northern border of NCR territory, or other wasteland homesteads, kept their legacy, creating some of the nicest, most understandable, and still tough troopers. Those guys don't have too many plans for big cities, and don't look twice at the lights of New Vegas, preferring to spend their lives at home or some podunk town reminiscent of the life they left behind. I think there was such a Reading guy in our failed leave group who was perfectly content with spending it at that dumpy little 188 post. I'm not sure what to say about troopers from Dayglow, considering I hadn't met too many of them. I joined that battalion coming up from the hub, and the 2 other random companies at Forlorn Hope were from Boneyard and Mojave respectively, although I did hear that a few replacements for another company were from there. What I've heard is that everyone there is slightly mutated. I hadn't seen any ghouls in the service, at least not yet, but that town is sorta known for scav. Again, I don't know too much, but if you see a trooper with an extra toe, or one who's good with old world trash, they're from Dayglow, I guess. Next is probably the new Reno trooper. Though I still didn't know too much about the town, or even if it was actually part of the NCR, new Reno troopers were known pretty well in a couple ways, and somewhat similar to hub types. I suppose the best description for a trooper from there could be based on that Corporal Hutsky I talked about during the section on camp punishments. Always with the best stories, funniest jokes, and only sincere with their friends in the heat, they often found themselves in trouble. If they weren't looking for a ticket out of that city through service, they were conscripts who got themselves in trouble back home and carried over their habits straight to the Forlorn Hope jail. Sometimes they were both. Everything I heard about that city describes somewhat anarchy and autonomy from the NCR, but I'm not sure how to describe it. Like I said, if a new Reno trooper didn't join up to get away, they were conscripted somehow. I think the NCR government itself isn't even sure if they own New Reno, especially considering other talk about gang control. Nevertheless, if troopers from there aren't your typical flag-waving diehards, they're at least pleasant company and loyal to whoever has their back in the no-mans. The next type of trooper is the one who isn't predictable, the Mojave troopers. The NCR military had been in the Mojave for at least a few decades in small, and then big ways. Some people from the Mojave liked what the NCR had been doing, trying to civilize the lands and all, so they joined up. Some escaped prison sentences or time on the chain gang after arrest in NCR jurisdiction, and took the option to serve. Others simply liked the idea of getting regular meals and access to neat firearms. until they get to Forlorn Hope, where their pristine rifle from a better station is confiscated for the raid boys in exchange for a busted piece of trash. Like I mentioned earlier, one of the companies at Forlorn Hope was attached to a Mojave battalion, and though they had their own little jokes or bits about being close to home, they were great company in the fray. After all, they were fighting for their homes and joined the only foreign army trying to help instead of enslave. Although that company was constantly replenished by troopers from everywhere, Mojave troopers were still pretty recognizable by their jargon and talk of familiarity with the region. Even though Mojave boys varied in loyalty or priorities, troublemaking and conforming, we were all together in the heat, gunsmoke, and dust. The final type of trooper you might see is one who shouldn't really be there. Example, me. That random sort of person was from an NCR town without its own culture like Junktown or Sacktown, from an autonomous tribal village, or from some other tiny indescript location or background. These sorts of people usually just blended in or were categorized as one of the above types of troopers. Either way, wherever a trooper was from, they all found their place or added their own unique color to the scene that was the heat, but in such a way that was a little more unique than what we could see from those south of the observation line. As for our enemy, I don't know much about the Legion Army firsthand, since I've never been in it and hopefully never will, but from everything I've heard and everything I've seen, if there are any differences in their units, I only learned about it through standard trooper knowledge and the accounts from guys like that Searchlight trooper, who happened to be a boneyard patriot type. Apparently, there are unique cultures in the ranks of our enemy, and though they may be small, their fanaticism nearly buries anything you'd notice in the chaos of an attack. In my bit about the prisoners, and the legionary who killed PFC Dawn, I described those legionaries as Arizonans, though I didn't know what that really meant at the time. Even propaganda back in Sacktown described them as the worst. Again, you wouldn't stop to consider who was swinging at you in the fray, but Arizonans are most definitely the worst. Brutal, vicious, merciless, and absolutely zero chance of their surrender. I suppose that can explain why the legionaries we captured way back when broke their own jaws, or pounded on the bars psychotically after their suicides were interrupted by capture. Like I said, the fact we even captured legionaries of any kind was a miracle. Anyway, troopers talk of traitors from the East meeting with NCR, and those traitors talked about the difficulty of the Arizona desert in general. Despite those neutral traitors talk about regional safety out that way under Legion occupation, they too vouch for the sadistic nature of any legionary who's labeled an Arizonan. Traitors tell a story from out that way talking about a legend in Arizona or the Sonoran wasteland. The stories we hear praise the Legion for stabilizing Arizona and credit it to a single man who isn't Caesar. The legend of a man called the Interfector of Phoenix, or Murderer of Phoenix, details a metropolitan oasis in the middle of Arizona that was utterly obliterated because of him. Vowing to help the people of Arizona by joining some moral organization, he exploited their open hearts and abandoned his honor for a place at Caesar's side. Even though the story was told with dread, the twisted story we hear thanks the Interfector, or Murderer, for taming the Sonoran wastes. Although, one theme of the story remained despite the years: never trust an Arizona drifter. Even though a person may seem kind-hearted or noble, you don't know what they'll do in the end. Tribals conscripted into the Legion embraced the murderer's story and cut out any kindness or honor in their hearts. Those Arizona tribals used the Interfector as an example of how to achieve glory and approval in the eyes of Caesar. That makes Arizonans the most horrifically savage and loyal members of the Legion, whether they want to be or even know that they are. The other big story about Arizona pertains to the Legion's current number 2 and battlefield commander that the Rangers have talked about. Caesar's biggest commander, Legate Lanius, is said to also be from Arizona. If the propaganda posters showing the Legate's supposed mask and stories of what he does to the conquered are true, I think it's safe to say that he only confirms the reputation of Arizona legionaries. So, the standard trooper bit goes: if you see a tall legionary who takes time out of the battle around him just to play with his victim's blood and revel in the mess, or if you see a rabid legionary who took 10 troopers to subdue and halt his suicide, he's probably an Arizonan. The next type of legionaries are those from New Mexico, far beyond anywhere a soldier with a bear patch on his uniform has been. Again, most of the information we lowly troopers had on them was from independent traders who occasionally crossed the Colorado into the West. Though still horrific, and still likely to crucify those troopers captured in that raid squad, New Mexican legionaries are somewhat known for having some sympathy or even hesitancy to the Legion's brutal ways. Apparently, there used to be plenty of peaceful tribes all across New Mexico, and though they weren't afraid of self-defense, they were systematically slaughtered or absorbed by the Legion over many years while the famous Arizona campaign was still going on. Rangers say that the New Mexican tribals were very spiritual and believed in many superstitions that the tribes spread to others. It was because of this notion that Rangers believed stories about the Legion's former second, Legate Graham, or Joshua Graham's merciless reputation spread like wildfire long before Hoover Dam. While he was conquering New Mexico, tribals who escaped Graham's wrath told of atrocities that led to bounties offered by Desert Rangers back before they were integrated into the NCR Rangers. However, once those New Mexican tribes were conquered by the Legion, some of that storytelling lingered, and still with a fixation on the old Legate Graham. Many troopers believe it is because of New Mexican legionaries that stories of the Legate Graham turned, the burned man, circulated in Legion camps, and even escaped into the Mojave. Those tales say that the old Legate still walks, even after what we all know happened to him for failing Caesar at Hoover Dam. Getting back to the enemy's culture and how it impacts us. All things about the New Mexican legionaries' culture and background in timidity and storytelling. Troopers say that New Mexican legionaries are the best you could face. Given their supposed ingrained beliefs, even under the Legion banner, some call New Mexican legionaries cowards or the preferable alternative to the other types of red-clad crazies. I don't look that deep though. I take a look at the uniform and see the aftermath. I don't think I'd call anyone under Caesar's banner a coward. If anyone says a New Mexican is preferable, I'd say, tell that to the guys on that failed raid squad. Most of those raid boys didn't come back, and despite their plausible origin and refusal to attack that night, I knew there would be a couple new crosses down south the next morning. And I was correct. Although the New Mexican legionaries' supposed mercy or cowardice was nearly buried by the uniform and flag of Caesar, I did hear one trooper talk about a legitimate reason for the assumption. There was a big battle against the Legion sometime after Hoover Dam that brought about ideas of the New Mexicans' lack of fanaticism for Caesar. When our boys in brown finally caught their breaths after that mess at Hoover Dam, and after recovering from some natural disaster out west, a bunch of troopers were sent to take the fight across the Colorado at a place called Arizona Spillway, quite some ways south of us. The planning for the operation had Rangers infiltrate the enemy ranks at Arizona Spillway, where they learned the Legion fortification was occupied by a force of fillers from New Mexico. Intel didn't even know what or if that meant anything, so our guys eventually crossed the Colorado and took some derelict resort, beating back many legionaries rather easily than initially planned for. Although NCR supply chains were disrupted after the initial victory, and the legionaries only really fell back or retreated to encircle the landing zone. Even though the Battle of Arizona Spillway was considered a success, when scouts caught sight of Legion columns with Arizona banners approaching, blood-painted banners, command of the battle deemed the location too difficult to hold and fell back across the Colorado. The initial fight being a fairly easy success, the troopers deemed the initial New Mexican garrison as weaker than usual because of that fact. From there, the stereotype spread through our ranks, especially when old Ranger talk of New Mexican tribal culture mixed with it. I suppose if the consensus is true, some of the legionaries from that far-off land still had a lot of timidity and reluctance for Caesar ingrained in them, despite the stories of that brainwashing I hear goes on in Legion soldier camps. Bottom line, if you see a legionary running away, actually retreating from the fight to regroup, or if one of them lets you withdraw, they're probably a New Mexican. Either that, or they have a New Mexican commander who may actually care about battlefield losses. Colorado legionaries are the next type of legionary, and something we supposedly deal with all the time. They're also probably the reason for my failed leave plans. Troopers talk about stories they heard, describing when the Legion was invading Colorado. All the while, their troops were getting ambushed, getting their supply line severed, and having their New Mexican columns attacked by Colorado tribal raiders. Legion was focused on some big tribal city called Dogtown, but had to simultaneously fight a guerrilla war against the other Colorado tribes. One by one, the tribal raiders were picked off or conscripted until the Legion encircled Dogtown. Though the battle for Dogtown itself supposedly lasted many weeks, the Legion won, but also had to battle the hordes of rabid dogs that gave the town its name. The Colorado tribals really strained the Legion's supply lines and logistics during the focus on Dogtown. The reason the city was besieged for so long, if the stories are true, was because of that style of fighting. But like I said, as those tribals were slowly eliminated, and after Dogtown fell, Caesar put those kinds of tribals on the job of raiding supply lines and towns essential to his next enemy. The addition of the famous Dogtown, Denver Hounds, to the ranks only added to the character of the savage raiders at Caesar's disposal. I still had yet to actually see one of those famous Denver Hounds in person at this point, but after the Legion took Dogtown, the army south of us harnessed their most recent conquest abilities with dogs and fully integrated them into the army as well. The Legion's use of Denver Hounds became so well implemented that the very image of those snarling beasts was a common symbol of the Legion that their picture was the subject of the first propaganda. Images to line a wall back in Sac Town, since the implementation of their favorite pets, and coupled with Colorado tribal specialty in raiding things, legionaries from Colorado made up the scouts, raid teams, and even many of their spies. If those guys weren't excelling in getting close enough to cut throats out in no man's, they were taking their pets out the west road from Nelson to hit caravans while keeping us pinned. The standard trooper bit goes, if your supply caravan gets hit before you can fire, or if you see a man in red with a snarling and mangy four-legged sidekick watching your every move from a cliff, they're probably some of Caesar's Colorado boys. The last real distinct group in our enemy's twisted culture are the Utahs. Recent word from some of the new Rangers says Caesar is still fighting in Utah while giving us heck all along the Colorado River. Those Rangers describe Utah as a beautiful place with not much civilization. Much like the other places Caesar conquers, it's full of tribals. The big picture shows every tribe from there as either peaceful and reclusive or outright savage and merciless. Even though only a small sliver of Utah is under Caesar, according to Ranger accounts, you can tell which tribes he actively recruits from. The famous old story of the Legion's former second-in-command, Legate Graham, say he was supposedly from Utah. Word said that he belonged to one of those peaceful and reclusive tribes that had a thing for old-world religions, but he found himself in Arizona and developed a reputation east of the river that reached NCR, as I talked about in the New Mexico section. I suppose Graham was born in the wrong tribe, because the stories about him are too profane for me to really write about. As I previously talked about, there's more to that guy, and even that ghost story in the Legion's lines, if the supposed New Mexican legionary tales are true. But the savagery of those Utah legionaries is comparable to Arizonans. I think the one distinguishing feature about Utahs is that if they aren't known for savagery, they're known for their smarts. I'm not sure how that characteristic came to be, but perhaps it was from Legate Graham's strategy across northern Arizona and New Mexico, at least up until his famous blunder at Hoover Dam. We knew pretty much nothing legitimate about our enemy in Nelson, whether their attacks were sometimes from Arizonans, New Mexicans, Utahs, or a mix, or if their raids were exclusively led by Colorados. We didn't know for sure. However, the way they've held Nelson so firmly, while giving us heck at the same time, leads many to believe that whoever is in charge over there is a Utah. Perhaps the commander over at Nelson learned a thing or two from the late Legate Graham about holding a place while not being overzealous and losing what he had. Perhaps Utahs had that tactical mindset in common and learned easily from other Utahs' mistakes. Although, perhaps the commander at Nelson wasn't a Utah. I was inclined to believe that the commander over there was a Colorado, especially thinking about the way they took Nelson without too much trouble. On the other hand, the commander at Nelson could have been an Arizonan, if his repeated use of those horrific savages was any indication. We were fairly certain Nelson's commander wasn't a New Mexican, if the stereotypes were true, but perhaps that played into the likely Utah strategy. Perhaps the trooper consensus was correct. That guy in charge of Nelson was a war-minded Utah who knew how to keep us down, hit the western highways, and hold Nelson all at the same time. Or perhaps there's only one low-level guy in charge of holding Nelson, while Caesar or some other distant big-shot officer just sends his folks through Nelson as a staging point. We don't know crap about how the Legion command really works. You see a featherhead, shoot him first if you can. Either way, to summarize the little-known Utahs, if your unit is taking continuous heat from a crafty and easily adapting Legion commander, or if faced with another suicidally savage guy in sporting gear, they're probably a Utah legionary. I learned a lot of this over time on the line, but that incident after the failed raid squad, and after talking with the searchlight trooper, I got to thinking again about our enemy. Despite their tiny differences we can see, I have no experience with legionaries off the line, or ones who aren't extra savage from being in NCR custody. I can't tell you if they joke around after chow, comfort their buds when things are extra stressful, or if they write letters to their likely slave wives before coming to our lines. I couldn't tell you if they have lighter punishment for menial things other than crucifixion, or how they pass time while waiting for action. I can only say that we've seen them too many times in the heat or sandstorms, and pick up a thing or two about their supposed cultures in the odd story from out east. Reflecting on our differences with those in the enemy's ranks, one overall theme got me thinking. The diverse nature of an NCR unit didn't matter in the way it apparently does in the Legion. Everything I mentioned about NCR troopers didn't really relate at all to war in the way I talked about Legion troops. In the end, Caesar is clearly a smart man, despite how horrible his fellas are. The little differences we pick up, if true, show he knows precisely who goes where and does what in his army. Even though his army still abides by the same savage culture regardless of where from, it's smart to not just call them barbarians because they do know how to adapt their brutal methods to keep our camps. Name: Forlorn Hope. Specialists in atrociousness. I think I can say the worst quality of the Legion is also their best one when compared to us. So many times before going out into no man's land, a trooper prays that they won't get captured or be given back, regardless of which particular job he's doing. I thought that myself when going on wire teams and trapper teams, but especially when I went on the occasional recovery team. You see a trooper from another company only a few days ago, paling around off the line, end up as a dehydrated and barely conscious mess with a proximity mine strapped to him. He shouts, "Get away," just as he sees you walk up before detonating. Like I said chapters ago, the trooper was listed as dead the moment he was captured. So what happens in No Man's is just to show whoever sees the detonation what is coming. Me and most of the other Forlorn Hope veterans who've survived this long were fairly used to that. Though it was terrorizing to anyone who just arrived from a different Mojave station, it was just standard procedure for us. A soul cries when they see a thing like that. But veteran Forlorn Trooper Bob collects all the recognizable parts in a sack, sees if the tags are intact, and collects whatever survived the blast as best as he could. All while doing this, he awaits a shot from the southern cliffs that may or may not come depending on how the legionary on watch is feeling that morning. The trooper and the recovery team then drag whoever they find up the winding path and unload the sacks of the mangled in the doc's tent. After cataloging the identity, if available, the sacks are taken to the graveyard overlooking the Colorado, a hole is dug, and the trooper wonders where the burial flags are. Just as he wonders this, an HQ boy smoking a cigarette by the cemetery reads the recovery boy's minds and says, "Shipment's late," or "got hit." The recovery team then buries any trooper, or the remains, in that cemetery, and walks to the company officer in charge of that recovery detail. Along the way, a trooper on reserve asks his buddy in the passing recovery detail, "Who'd you find out there today?" That trooper then responds with something along the lines of, "No clue. Explosion got rid of his name too. But I think it might have been Corporal Smith since he wasn't on a cross." The reserve trooper says, "Good riddance. Fella shorted me on a pack last week." The two then exchange a dry, dead, yet somehow still jovial chuckle. All the while, a few new troopers straight from Shady stare into nothing at the casual tone of the horror described. The young privates are crying inside, planning the letters to send home, planning out their wills, and wondering, am I going to end up a mutilated and unrecognizable mess, casually joked about by troopers who lost their sympathy? The answer, probably that, or they'll become one of those casual troopers. So, The recovery troopers meet with the officer in charge of the detail and run down their list of confirmed kills found and cross-reference that with the roster of who didn't return from that 100-yard, or raid squad. When all the records are settled, the detail collects the fallen troopers' wills or remaining letters from their squad tent's footlocker or duffel bag. Wills are sent home with the next outbound supply caravan, and one hopes the condolence-giving cargo isn't raided on the way home. Then, the recovery team is disbanded, and many start up a cigarette or chaw, thinking about what they saw, or plan the finer details of their fantasied leave week. Side note, I've mentioned my will and last message many times, so here's what mine said. Edward Harton/Ed Halong's last will and message. Mama, Pop, I think you all might have been right. The world outside of San Fran really got me good. Please don't let the NCR mark my memorial as a hubologist. I swear I made that my religion as a joke. You don't need another reason to disown me. Below is my military account details with instructions on how to access the funds in there. That should cover anything you may have spent on detectives looking for me. Sorry again about the whole running away and dying thing. My military account details with instructions for access. Anyway, given the whole emotional numbness and dying in sand dilemma, I suppose we Forlorn Hope veterans were similar to the Legion in that way. I started this off by talking about the Legion's best and worst quality. That being, they didn't recover or really care about their dead. Even though we still felt morally superior for doing so, it was so procedure that it didn't impact anymore. Although, there were times when I think even Command considered scrapping recovery teams, given their frequent ambushes. There were certain occasions when we thought we saw the Legion recovering their dead, but it turned out that they were just collecting some of their dead's equipment. I sometimes wondered what was told to legionaries about the topic of dying and what happens afterward. For some reason, I imagine myself sitting in a classroom as a brand new legionary, while a teacher with a large feathered helmet sat at a desk. Above the chalkboard, there was a giant picture of Caesar, and the teacher says, "Okay, class, open your textbooks to chapter 13, Dying for Caesar." Now that recruit Legionary Billy over there got his brain's empathy processor removed, we can cover this as a class. Everyone laughed at Legionary Billy, whose red face showed even behind his face mask and goggles. The teacher went on, "After taking a gunshot wound to the head from one of those evil and immoral NCR troopers, it is your sworn duty to not, and I repeat, not, shout for aid from your fellow legionaries." Legionary Johnny raises a hand and interrupts, "But what if it's not a lethal gunshot wound to the head? What if you can survive?" "Great question, Recruit Legionary Johnny." The teacher says before continuing, "It's imperative that you not distract your more healthy pals from their job of killing Californians. You don't want to disappoint Caesar, do you?" Everyone shakes their heads, and Recruit Legionary Bob asks, "How can we serve Caesar if we're injured then?" The teacher jumps right to it. "That's when you slice your neck with your machete, just like we practiced last week with the dummy blades." We all nodded, remembering last week's pre-chapter 13 lesson about killing ourselves. I ask, "After we've done our duty and died, will one of our fellas come back for our bodies once they've killed the profligates?" Our enthusiastic teacher says, No, not at all, Recruit Legionary Harton. Your stinking body will decay in the sun for failing Caesar. However, our whole class in suspense, the teacher gives a wink behind his spectacles and Legion-issue goggles. Even your corpse will continue to serve Caesar by emitting disease to any Californians who get too close. We all shout yay at the idea of serving Caesar even after we've died. The teacher shouts, "Now, who wants to practice crucifying captured dissolutes?" The whole class shouts, I do, I want to," as we make our way out the class door. Anyway, that's how I imagine that. Despite the Forlorn Hope troopers' acceptance of seeing so much death, one time, a recovery team was unable to do their job, and not because of the usual attack. Mutual adaptation. It was weak. Who knows when and at Forlorn Hope, and anywhere between 3 to 40 weeks after my failed leave, when a recovery team came back without a body, despite another recent failed raid squad. The reason for this lack of retrieval was because of something new the officer of the detail found out there. They found 3 bodies of our guys completely surrounded by half-buried yellow drums emitting radiation. Well, they couldn't prove that at the time given the team's lack of a Geiger counter. But immediately after the team's return, some of the guys on that recovery job were checked over by the doc. 3 of them were close enough for the doc's reader to show severe radiation. Although they didn't feel that way, it wasn't long before they were feeling woozy and throwing up everywhere. 3 more troopers added to medical. Though the doc had the stuff to treat them, they were still put in rest for a few days, and all-night raid teams had ended. Both sides of the no man's were silent as the grave during this time. This was the Legion's chance to catch their breath, and ours, in a sense. We celebrated the environmental disaster the Legion caused in no man's, and some of us placed bets on how they did it. There was no way to ever confirm how, but the consensus was split. Half of the troopers thought they brought out some rad suits for the special job, despite their aversion to that sort of tech. The other half thought that they used a few slaves or recruit legionaries to haul those barrels out there and die later. I was in that group. So, for the first time since the camp was made, we didn't have to worry about no man's. Although, the Legion adapted. They took that time to circle around the western mountains and hit our patrol groups. I was thankfully assigned to the northern routes during our week off the line. They also took that time to better hit the 95, since our guys had to move through the narrow canyons just to encounter a blockade. Again, the infamous NCR bureaucracy was cast aside as command dealt with the situation. Camp supply shortages were really starting to impact us at this point, and the Legion pinning us in the west made more supply runs difficult. The supplies sought after were radiation preventative drugs. With those, we could arm a few teams to excavate the barrels in an afternoon. But the doc didn't have any. Only a handful of drugs to treat those on that recovery detail, and NCR didn't want to endanger any independent civilians with bringing them to us. That also made mandatory Rad X care package requests from home a no-no. So, what command did was requisition a unit from back home for assistance in this matter. Since we couldn't get rad-resistant drugs, we could get rad-resistant troopers. 2 weeks after the discovery of the radiation problem in no man's, I think it was 2 weeks. The Western Legion blockade was smashed through by a company from the 66th Assault Battalion. When I heard we were going to get assistance, I didn't know it would come like this. The 66th were a specialized unit in the NCR military for all the misfits still wanting to serve in the army. They came in from the western trailheads ready to deal with our radiation problem. In case this wasn't clear, everyone in the little-known battalion was a ghoul. I was in the Western Watchtower, which was where I usually was during notable events if not on the observation line, and writing a couple letters from my stack of unsent letters that kept growing due to this camp shut-in. Side note, I've been keeping up with that trooper Elisa from McCarran that I met during the whole leave incident, alongside Andrea and Stacy. Last I heard from the little Elisa, she had just gotten out of the new Vegas MP brig for something involving her friends and a fountain in front of one of the casinos, apparently a typical place for drunken troopers to congregate and let loose. Then, Andrea was headed into the town of Reading with her pop to sell some goods and buy some war bonds. Lastly, Stacy promised to send a couple pictures to me in celebration of her recently published research paper and recognition ceremony back in Boneyard. I was pretty eager to hear from all of them, but the camp issues and blockage of the western passes made my own letters queue up. Anyway, I was in that tower with a ranger when the ghoul company of the 66 emerged from the cliffs under their battalion banner and company signature, the Rotten Sixes. The whole company of zombified troopers trickled their way out of the narrow canyons of our western trails and headed by a sneering, ragged, irradiated man by the name of Captain Donald Rathmore. I studied their banner and saw it was a white face that looked like the skin was sliding off, with 2 white stars on both sides. The whole emblem was on a dark yellow and black background. And written on the bottom of the company banner in white letters was that signature, the Rotten Sixes. I found their banner emblem rather appropriate, considering the leading Captain Rathmore's face looked just like their face symbol, but with a green beret sitting at a sharp angle above his murderous expression. Another side note, I mentioned that each company at Forlorn Hope was from a different unit. I was still under the 4th Regiment, 2nd Battalion of Home Guard Infantry, and still with the camp major's old unit, Bravo Company. even though just about everyone in my company who marched into the Mojave with me wasn't around anymore. The mishmash of troopers pulled from everywhere still belonged to the hub's own battalion, the Maltese Bouncers. The emblem of our unit was what looked like a white bird with crossed rifles below it on a dark blue background. I'm not sure where the name came from exactly, but I heard from a few hub troopers that it had something to do with a rough bar back at the hub, with a long history and infamous background. I don't know the precise regiments and battalions of the other infantry companies at Forlorn Hope, but I knew one was from another Home Guard regiment, and though I didn't get the battalion, I knew they were from Boneyard. I also knew that their signature was, the Bullet Farmers, would have been better if they were part of supply, and their emblem was strangely a couple of shaving razors around a Deathclaw skull. None of that unit's symbols seemed to make sense, but I probably didn't know enough about the NCR city of Boneyard or their history that could have inspired that. I guess that was something to ask Stacy about. That other infantry company was a local Mojave one, although it was replenished by troopers from across the desert and from those back in NCR. Their unofficial name or signature was Colorado Crossers, since the unit apparently saw its first action at Arizona Spillway. I couldn't tell you much more about the regiment or battalion the company belonged to, but since it was initially a conscript battalion, they had their own motto, Beats a Chain Gang. I wasn't sure about that motto, all things at Forlorn Hope considered, but I suppose the motto matched their company banner. Outside their company's tent group and shack house, their banner gave no reference to their nickname regarding battle on the Arizona side of the river, instead focusing on their motto. That banner was dark green, and their emblem spanned the whole flag, showing an iconic white trooper helmet and goggles on the left, a greater than sign, and a ball and chain on the right. Getting back to the moment, the rotten sixes of the 66th arrived and almost immediately got to work. They did, however, take a long time to do the seemingly short task, while their command strategized, and some of their specialists set about their tasks. Most of the new ghoul troopers were left to idle and await the moment they were needed. This made the new troops spend the first couple days mingling with us at the camp, on or off the line. Their commander, that Captain Rathmore, was a careful man/ghoul. Chatting with some of the ghoulish troopers, I learned that the company was reassigned to us after patrolling the I-15 for Brotherhood of Steel ambushes south of the Mojave border. Captain Rathmore and the other officers in the Ghoul Company approached the new task with that sort of caution. As the planning went slowly, and we adjusted to the new troopers, their arrival caused a stir in the camp, and not just because some troopers were uncomfortable with ghouls. Most issues came from the fact that they were more mouths to feed. Like I said, supplies were becoming a real problem, and CDL-2s were issued when a ghoul asked a camp veteran for a piece of his coveted stale bread he got 2 weeks prior. Other issues regarding food came from some believing that ghouls didn't have to eat or drink. I didn't know about that. I'd seen those ghoul troopers scarf down the disgusting mess hall chow, and even drink from the Forlorn Hope Spring, our radiated shower, like people in desperation. Trouble was stirred, but things remained largely fine as the ghouls continued their stay. I didn't mind the ghouls all that much, and most of the fellas who didn't care for ghouls didn't care enough to be bigoted in that way. We were all largely thankful for the extra guns and bodies, rotting or not, and so the only real incidents were regarding the new troopers' ignorance to camp traditions, like how we violently stormed the chow line. That, and the ghouls' card techniques. Some forlorn troopers learned the hard way how bad an idea it is to play a card game with a person who spent a bulk of their irradiated immortality perfecting their strategy. That's for games of skill. Gambling was different, but one of the big CDL-2 incidents during the ghouls' stay was when one of the reserve company troopers couldn't stand repeated losses during a tragic the garnering tournament. Fists were thrown, insincere words were shouted, the jail had new occupants, and though most of us got along with the ghouls, everyone was wondering what the plan was. The ghoul unit wasn't there for maybe more than 5 days in total. While most of them were idling with troopers on or off the line, some were pulled aside by their superiors and tasked with scouting the area, making notes on potential ambush spots, and calculating a response to any Legion action against their largely unknown plan. More delays were made when Captain Rathmore asked about the subsequent takeback of Nelson. That was news to everyone who heard that, including the HQ boys I was running papers for during alert duty. I overheard Captain Rathmore talking about sending his troops in to finish what we should have at the start. The only response from the camp major was, "Our orders are to hold this place." That was met with anger from the zombified captain. He wasn't content with being assigned to assist our camp without any sort of victory. The captain then went on with shouting and loud anti-human, slightly racist rhetoric while the HQ guys let him. Still standing outside the HQ tent with papers in hand, I heard an ample amount of profanity to the point where the HQ trooper had me come inside, so as to limit the noise coming out the tent door that was turning every head in the camp. I don't know why the HQ trooper didn't just keep me outside, or take my reports before closing the door, but the belligerent ghoul captain went on about, "General, wait and see Oliver." I was just fascinated to be inside the HQ command tent. We lowly regular infantry boys weren't ever allowed in. I stood by the door inside the tent and looked around at all the radio equipment, tables with papers, and electric lamps. Then, I felt something strange. It wasn't hot in there. Every other tent or shack in Forlorn Hope collected the heat in a way that made the outside sun preferable. Not this one, though. I looked for some kind of explanation for the cool sensation and found it. On the southern end of the HQ tent was a little vented box clearly connected to the outside generators. It was an air conditioner. Just as I began plotting a trooper revolt to seize the means of cool air production, I saw the other interesting thing. At a little table surrounded by consoles with a ham radio on top, there was a woman trooper sitting behind the desk. I briefly thought I died and went to some low-budget military version of heaven, or Quetzal. Was I getting heat stroke? Has there always been one woman at this camp? I thought all the women were removed weeks, months, years, or however long ago that was. I suddenly realized why we weren't allowed in the HQ tent. The air conditioning didn't matter. The troopers outside would tear this thing down just to get to the one woman at Forlorn Hope. Anyways, not long after trying to conceptualize the idea of a woman at Forlorn Hope, Captain Rathmore finished his rant. There, the angry, rad-resistant captain stormed towards the HQ tent exit and said the only thing he ever said to me. "Get the profanity out of my way, you profanity smoothskin." I was immediately and literally kicked out of the tent after him. Some of the troopers outside watched me go in, and some asked what I saw inside the legendary HQ mystery tent. I said that there was a woman and an air conditioner. As simple and honest as that was, the nameless troopers called me a liar. In the end, the radiation-immune captain abandoned his ambitions of fixing the stalemate after his true objective. The next day, he and his guys, ghouls, executed their overly planned task. The whole company was marched out. About half of them hung back in a long line across the no man's, while the other half excavated the barrels and long since decomposed troopers. Sure enough, the 66th was assaulted when the Legion caught wind of what was happening. But the ghoul captain's preparations were accounted for, and the ghouls in reserve suppressed any kind of real-ranged counterattack. The operation was again over in about an hour. The barrels were disposed of somewhere east of the no man's and the company of ghouls with it. I have no idea where that company of the 66th went after that, but the radiation problem was over and dealt with, and the normal routine came back instantly. As soon as the valley was clear of ghouls carting drums of radioactive waste, guns were thrown back onto the observation line. As the crimson wave came across the barbed wire and shell holes in the dusk, the order, "Send 'em out," was shouted in its familiar fashion, and the guns thundered left and right as the order turned to, "Pour it on 'em." It was all back to normal. Trouble on the home front line. After the radiation incident and the return to normal, things didn't go completely to normal. When the Legion blocked us off in the west, a lot of the raiders remained. Most of the incidents were thwarted by a patrol from Helios, but caravans without sufficient protection were hit hard. It was also in this time that a new CDL punishment was added: supply runs. I was actually there for the incident that set that off. Off the line, my day job was guard duty at the Western Trailhead Section 3. Our little team was only 3 strong, and we knew to expect an incoming supply team from the reserve company that was sent in the night. Going to Helios at midnight, it wasn't long after morning chow that they'd come in, waiting at our post, and dreading the moment the sun finally rose over the tall eastern mountains. They came in, or so I thought. I was the first one to see the escort round a wall of the trail. So, I shouted my pride for the new identity phrase in my jovial way despised by the camp mopers and frowned upon by NCOs. Gimme a J. Expecting the J, I heard my squad buddy mutter in a dead tone attempting joy. Gimme a U. The distant escort didn't give me a J or a U. My own fun way of asking the new security phrase spelled out J-U-N-K, and then the phrase was met by the incoming party, Junktown Janice. Again, none of that happened. Figuring the supply escort was just in a pissy mood, I still had to ask the question. So, I shouted seriously, what is the passphrase? No reply. The trooper escort stopped, and my buds stood up perplexed. After a silence, the trooper at the head shouted back, "We're good. It's Sergeant Thompson coming in." My pal, PFC Green, counted the supply runners to himself and asked our guard group how many were in last night's supply crew. "I'm counting 3 right now." He paused for a minute and then shouted at the supply escorts, "Did you fellas take any hits out there?" The distant head of the escort responded, "Yeah." Had to turn Private Stevens' body in with Helios. There was no use shouting with the supply boys. Orders were orders, and I prodded for the passphrase again. "Who you wanna bang back home?" The distant escort shouted, "What?" "Look, Elliot is wounded." Everyone in camp knew the passphrase for any kind of patrol or team that enters the camp. The answer was simply Junktown Janice, and took 2 seconds to shout. I even heard about a guy who collapsed from heat stroke within sight of a guard post who managed to shout it out. Clearly, something was up. My guard group was thinking the same thing, and we climbed over the sandbags with weapons drawn. PFC Green shouted on approach, "Get on your knees right now." The head of the escort stayed put as we got closer and shouted, "Look, do we gotta do this right?" You know, profanity it. Like lightning, the other 2, quote, troopers, unslung their rifles and attempted to fire. 1 shot and no more. Their service rifles probably jammed. Don't ever steal a rifle from a Forlorn Hope squad. It'll be more dangerous to you than your target. Either way, the hostile troopers were almost immediately hit by our group in the second long panic. I, however, accidentally pulled both triggers on the stupid shotgun they gave me, and had no idea if I hit one or if I was always aiming at the sky. The dust clouded the short distance between us, and the thudding of footsteps was heard. Through the distorted mix of gun smoke and dust, I saw the head of the escort running at Green. Reflexively, I threw myself into the hostile man dressed in trooper fatigues, knocking both of us to the ground. On top of the cretin, and unsure exactly what was happening, I felt another person get added to the dog pile. I heard PFC Harper shout, "Put down the web," but was cut off. Blinded by the dust, and disoriented by my pounce, I felt a splash across my face. We collected ourselves. If the troopers' refusal to give the password or their sudden hostilities didn't say they were Legion spies, the open throat of the guy I tackled did. Anyway, at least these legionaries were nice enough to bring in the supplies, and not raid with C4 either. How considerate. The 3 disguised legionaries were revealed to be killed in the scuffle. The other 2 were killed by our group's guns, but the legionary pretending to be Sergeant Thompson had clearly killed himself. The conflict was short. Only Green was wounded, and not from the faulty service weapons turned against us. During the fight, and after tackling the last one, I couldn't see, but the guy was flailing a machete around trying to hit me when Green added himself to the pile. The wild machete slashed his arm good before Harper could get his bearing, and I was still struggling to see the man I slammed into. After it was all over, and more troopers came to give assistance, we saw to Green's injury. His injury wasn't too bad, but still needed to be tied off. That would have been the end of it if we didn't study the weapon that gave him the wound. Legion tends to do this often, and I should have mentioned it earlier. But the machete that opened Green's arm was a rusty and bloody mess that was dipped in some kind of fecal matter, human or animal was irrelevant. After seeing the weapon, we got some guys from the reserve to man the post as me and Harper took Green to the dock. Legion definitely had a habit of making us suffer even if we ultimately won. Green got to keep his arm, thankfully, but others who'd been hit by those disgusting legionary service weapons weren't as lucky. Anyway, that was the end of the regular supply teams, and the beginning of a new camp punishment. Most of Forlorn Hope supplies came to us in the past from places like McCarran or Helios, making the occasional supply mission from within the camp a unique opportunity. There hadn't been too many supply teams sent out before that one my leave group met with. So, those given the supply runner job in the past saw that as their own little vacation away from forlorn hope. Not anymore. With the Legion taking advantage of our crippled and exposed West, the folks at Nelson saw a new way to make our lives heck. Still not shy of nighttime raids, they put real focus on cutting our dwindling supplies. Even though getting supplies was dangerous, the Legion fully expected a large group to give protection to a supply train. That'd leave the no-mans exposed for a rush, and thus came the punishment aspect. Quartermaster Mays was in charge of the HQ company's logistics boys and camp supplies. He was a pretty nice guy, so some of the fellas felt bad for him when he was ordered to create the rosters for supply runs from names on the MP cat's paw. Somehow the camp vets felt more bad for him than the guys put on the job. I guess attitude and fairness generates more sympathy than those getting drafted onto a dangerous job. On a supply run, you'd have probably a 50-50 chance of coming back. Though the supplies did come in sometimes, even if they were hit, you were almost considered good as dead if you left. And all guns had to keep focusing on Nelson in case of something funny. They knew we could repel any attack from the south, but any supply runners that came back wouldn't be enough. And apparently word from McCarran said they were tied up with their own raider problems. Little Lord Caesar had us right where he wanted us. Maybe. Why didn't troopers on supply runs escape forlorn hope by desertion? No idea. Maybe some of those who planned to got killed on the way out. Maybe it was patriotism. Maybe it was a sense of duty to us at camp. Maybe they knew they'd be found by a road patrol. I couldn't tell you why, or even if supply runner desertions were reported. All I can say is that supplies did come back on occasion, and nobody talked about why, not even those who made it back. Ammo and decent food being the most lacked supplies. The order to send 'em out was called less and less as the days, weeks, months, years, or however long went by. Operational service, battle, and sharpshooter hunting rifles were almost solely reserved or saved for the raid squads and patrols of the western canyons by this point. Guard posts were trained in those terrible yet somehow sturdier shotguns, and a few veteran rangers from Hoover came down to teach some of their skills. Why didn't we get supplies from Hoover, you ask? It's because they apparently didn't have the rations or ammo to spare. Despite the replenishment troopers who came from there, the armories and food stores were, officially, empty. Word from those Hoover boys talk about overflowing armories and waterfalls of bullets, but the commanders there deemed those supplies essential. They were the prime target for the Legion, but they didn't seem to see the kind of regular action we did. I don't know what to make of the situation over there, and things were bad at Forlorn. But the addition of those rangers seemed pretty helpful. Even though things were especially bleak at Forlorn Hope, I always prided myself on making the best of terribleness. Maybe I inherited that from my parents, or my adopted parents, but either way, I knew how to smile when I cooked rat or ant meat. I even brought out my inner chef. Things weren't so bad that we were forced to eat ants and rats, but meat was removed from our already meager diets to be replaced by a surplus of local vegetables and 200-year-old beans. The rats and ants were just something more. Lots of troopers regretted giving away their issued cooking cans in exchange for cigarettes, but I kept mine. No longer were the days of pitting mutated scorpions and ants against each other. Troopers get hungry. Keeping some spare beans from chow, throw them into your cup with water, toss in some good bits of ant, maybe sprinkle a touch of vegetables and juice, heat over a fire, or let sit in the sun. And you got a decent snack for the observation line or your offline duty. So, when we weren't doing the usual thing between sending warning shots at Legion scouts or improvising with rat and ant recipes, certain periods in the day had squads get called to the HQ end. Those rangers from Hoover taught hand-to-hand combat drills to different squads of the companies throughout the regular shifts. I thought those were fun, and wondered if command did this for legitimate purposes, or for morale. We learned new moves for taking people down, although that was my apparent specialty, and defenses and offenses and all that jazz. Since the Legion preferred fighting up close, and most troopers only really knew how to thrust a bayonet, this new knowledge was pretty essential. I wondered why they didn't teach us this sooner, but I figured it had something to do with the ammo shortages. and how most of us were using those awful over-under shotguns. That didn't account for the raid squads and former 100-yard boys that had always met with the Legion regularly. A little side bit of knowledge from the Rangers was also the making of improvised explosives. This was surprising when sparring and learning the different kinds of punches or takedowns turned into making bombs or fuses with a few shell casings, a tin can, a paper clip, and Brahmin excrement. I couldn't quite figure out how to make the homemade bombs, but could figure out the fire bottles pretty easily. If supply didn't have enough grenades for some big fiasco, I could at least throw a glass bottle full of generator fuel with a lighted bootlace fuse if I had to. Either way, I understood the hand-to-hand drills, but couldn't quite figure out the reason for the explosives. I couldn't tell you if we were preparing for some big desperate defense, offense, or if this was just another mandatory morale activity. Perhaps it was a bit of all of those. There were always Rangers at Forlorn Hope since it became the front line, but the new Rangers started ticking a few troopers off. Days on the line, protecting the camp, running patrols, and fending off attacks seemed sorta upsetting compared to the new Rangers and their being there. The issue wasn't in their demeanor since most Rangers were really humble, but it was because people started to really notice how they always seemed not mad about being at Forlorn Hope. They rotated with the other Rangers in the towers, or provided relief wherever they were needed. They helped out the docks, and they ran messages to the Ranger outpost north of us. Even though they had their own tasks, the fact that they didn't get heat stroke has often upset some troopers. Troopers accused Rangers of flaunting their free, not Army infantry regulated time around. Even though non-upset troopers usually irritated the vets of the camp, the arrival of the new Rangers magnified that spite on top of all the other issues. This only added to the mopers. Mopers were, of course, the troopers who mope. Usually they were new guys recently sent to Forlorn Hope as replacements for troopers we lost. That was understandable. Seeing what the Forlorn boys go through daily, eating big ants, not having enough ammo, and getting disciplined harshly for mild infractions made their old stations a sweet dream that only led to sadness in the present. That wasn't even to mention the near-nightly Legion attacks, or chaotic frenzies lurking in a sandstorm. Those new guys usually show up, see what their life is going to be, and that's when those stages of tragedy happen. It's usually during the depression stage that they write their wills and mope around. However, this period at Forlorn Hope was especially forlorn considering the supply issues. Even some of my pals and Sergeant Holmes started getting depressed or angry again at little things. I again can't say for sure why I didn't feel that way when morale everywhere was plummeting, but I wasn't the only one. I wasn't super giddy about things, of course. Everything around me was pretty bad in one way or another my entire time there. Like I mentioned before, some of us were just born into it. Devastating news makes my brain go, oh well, guess this awful thing is something new we gotta deal with. Or, good. The old brand of misery was getting boring. Because of that strangely developed mindset, I hadn't even thought about death in a long time. In the end, I figured that I won't really be around to get too upset if I got killed. So, during this time, guys like me often explained things to some of the new fellas. Though I wasn't brimming with life, I wasn't a moper who constantly brought death into the topic of telling new troopers how things run. I also wasn't one of those guys who complained about how I should have qualified for first recon to avoid this place, or prophesized that we were all doomed because of Justice for Bitter Springs. I was simply the guy who was able to say what needed to be done without espousing what I was really thinking, such in the case of Corporal Lopez. Corporal Lopez was a replacement who joined our platoon after that particular vacancy-causing incident happened. It isn't often that PFCs tell corporals how the front line is run, but the guy was from the Mojave border outpost, and the corporals and sergeants of the company were all too sour on their duties. I tell you, this guy was shaking the whole time. It was like the young man, older than me, was having a seizure the entire time I showed him the rundown of off-the-line duties. I showed him around the camp just as a couple CDL2s were getting escorted to the jail, while the reserve company geared up for a patrol backup, and a couple squads took their shower in the radioactive pool. Shots came from the canyon trail the corporal came from, and an alert trooper ran from the post with his new standard-issue blunderbuss to gather a reserve squad. I showed him the patrol route map on the duty roster, right by the filled-up MP cat's paw, and then walked him over to the observation line. He seemingly looked through the ragged, dirt-covered troopers sitting on the line, looking puzzled at the guys who occasionally glanced over the top. Not me, or any of the soldiers he saw on the line had a regulation haircut, recognizable trooper uniform, inspection-worthy weapon. And some were even sitting on little cushions made entirely of spent brass. He shook more and more as he looked out at the barbed wire and shell-dotted landscape. But that was when the standard issue cherry on top the Forlorn Hope Sunday arrived. Of course, a recovery team was hauling up the bodies of abducted troopers they found. No joking, merely another dry, who you find out there, Sarnt, from the trailhead sentries. Welcome to Forlorn Hope. It's exactly what the rumors said, and then some. Despite the corporal's shaking, that sight of the recovery team didn't crack anything in him. Not long after that, the sun was almost set, and the formation was called for the end of the offline company's workday. The corporal met his squad, and the grimy, sour-faced sergeant he was now subordinate to. I caught glimpse of his guys smile and graciously meet the new corporal, only to turn right back to their sour selves when he went down the line. Formation was over, chow was called, and I stormed the mess hall. Of course, there hadn't been any real meat for weeks, just trays full of corn and old beans. I was sitting on the end of my group of fellas when the corporal popped a squat next to me. Though I was a tad surprised he didn't sit with his sergeant or the other corporals, I wasn't even in his squad. I asked the still shaking man, "Ya hungry, corporal?" Lifting a spoonful of vegetables and setting it down, he said the 8th sentence I heard him say the whole afternoon. No, not real. I'm not hungry. I watched the raid squad gearing up to go down and saw the convulsing man. I shrugged and said sincerely, "Nerves'll do that to ya, but hey, I got a stash of my special seasoned ant meat in my duffel bag. Swing by my tent later if you get hungry." I think that was the moment he clicked in line with the rhythm of panic the new guys get. The man was ready to burst since arriving, but mentioning my seasoned ant meat was apparently what did it. I took a lot of pride in that recipe, so I tried not to take offense. He frantically dropped his plate, whipped a notebook out of his pack, and started scribbling on the page, probably his will. I gave him a nudge while considering how my secret pocket ant would complement this salty corn and said, "You're gonna be all right, fella." Reaching into my pocket for my specially reserved pocket sand-speckled main course, I noticed his frantic writing was ruined by the sounds of gunshots from the observation line behind us. He broke the pencil at another short but louder crackle of gunfire, and he dropped his notebook on the dirt while the raid squad sped up their readying. Corporal Lopez sat there stunned, unable to move or pick up his notebook off the ground, and I patted his helmet. Patting his helmet and then shoulder, I said very sincerely and awkwardly, there. I think, having never comforted someone above my pay grade. Still stunned and mute, the gunfire died and one of my pals shuffled over, new Corporal Wright. The PFC saw the distraught corporal and took a place on the opposite side. As the PFC indulged in some of the less sand-ruined pieces of the corporal's dropped meal, he said, "You're gonna be fine, Trooper Tom. Write a letter home if it'll settle ya. And don't worry, you'll get used to here." Me and my pal were silent again, while the corporal collected himself steadily. I really liked what my pal said in that moment. He was one of the worst mopers in our platoon, and though I won't say his name, I really took to heart what he said and did despite his own misery. Yeah, he was one of the guys extra upset given the conditions around camp, but he threw all that aside at least momentarily for the sake of the corporal too shocked by the new world around him. Now that I think of it, that reminds me of a story I heard. A story I lived, one I saw lived, and one I saw in every face that's ever been on the line at Camp Forlorn Hope. The Forlorn Fighter. This story comes from everyone at Forlorn Hope, and is not based on the list for troopers in search of pen pals. Some of this story applies to me, some of it applies to a bit of everyone else. The story is the amalgamation of everyone who's ever been on the observation line, had a gun pointed south, or eyes set on the no man's. You can get the story by asking anyone who's been at Forlorn Hope, but I wrote it from the view of Trooper Joe. Here's the story of Trooper Joe. Trooper Joe grew up with stars in his eyes and dreamt of greatness. He joined the NCR military because it seemed like the only thing to do considering his upbringing. Joe had never seen real conflict, but he knew all about it from his parents. Knowing what he's about to take part in, he enlists and gets put into the 5th Regiment, 14th Volunteer Battalion of Home Guard Infantry. Immediately assigned to the Camp Seth Training Corps outside Shady Sands, his hometown, he felt pride in no longer just seeing it from the distance. Training, of course, was hard. The 4 weeks were more than any of those conscripts got, but he fell right in line and thought of his family's legacy. The only other thing that kept him going in training was images of those posters in his mind about what was threatening to take over the Mojave. Training had ended, and he was finally able to call himself a private of the new California Republic Army, a title he dreamed made reality. The unit being a hometown one of volunteers, the city threw a parade in honor of the valiant new soldiers offering themselves in service of those in a foreign land. Marching through the streets, the parade dispersed, and all the new soldiers found their families. Joe's family embraces him with tears of pride in their eyes, and Joe sees the organization he was now part of in his family's eyes. Joe saw the lasers and plasma beams across the landscape, just like his mother saw at Navarro. Joe saw the bullets and bodies his father saw while defending the borders against raiders. Joe even saw the crimson wave his brother saw come down on Hoover Dam. He even saw his brother's experience against the Great Khan menace. Trooper Joe knew war. He'd been raised by heroes. Joe was ready. Even though he was ready, Joe found his pack unusually heavy as the wasteland sun came down. His battalion was, of course, on its way to the Mojave. Even the corporals, sergeants, officers, and everyone in between hated marching in the heat. But everyone's spirits were high with dreams of New Vegas. Everyone except Joe. Trooper Joe didn't join up to gamble in a neon town. He joined up to save it from the menace trying to destroy it. Trooper Joe's battalion arrived at the famous border of the Mojave, and through the monument they went. It was there that the battalion was further divided by company, and Joe's heart sank when he learned he was going to Camp McCarran. All his friends in the company cheered, and Joe grumbled. As his company arrived at McCarran, things were looking good. Arriving in the day, the company set up in their section, and Joe was still pissy about not going to take his brother's place at the dam. That was until he saw the lights of New Vegas. There was something magical about those lights that made Trooper Joe's brain say, maybe this won't be so bad. And it certainly wasn't. Trooper Joe adapted and fell into the routine of McCarran. He was part of patrols that helped fend off the Outer Vegas raiders, and he took a lot of pride in that. It wasn't until the weekend hit, and his company was given liberty that things were changing. On liberty. Trooper Joe made it a point to stay away from New Vegas after seeing the drunk troopers stepping off the train and getting into trouble on base. That was until the attractive magic of those lights finally broke him, and he decided to check it out. After all, might as well see the town the military he joined was keeping safe. It wasn't long until Trooper Joe became complacent. This was his life. Trooper Joe lived for the next liberty. He started skipping out on his patrols by feigning illness, only to miraculously recover the second liberty hit. He forgot all about the enemy across the Colorado as he blew his pay on drinks, rooms, and luxury in the fancy bright casinos. Trooper Joe's drunken binges and good times with his pals got him in trouble, and soon enough, he was well known by all the MPs of the Strip. The MPS brig was a second barracks for Trooper Joe, and his CO and sergeant had bailed him out for the last time. The LT of his platoon wanted him sent to Camp Golf to wait out the rest of the tour doing menial work in disgrace. But Trooper Joe's record was too good for that. Trooper Joe had the badge of an expert marksman from training, courtesy of those gecko hunting trips he always went on with his dad. The infamous Camp Forlorn Hope had a vacancy for a decently skilled, if not a bit rowdy trooper. So, Camp Forlorn Hope it was. Trooper Joe made the march to Forlorn Hope with 3 other New Vegas brig regulars and 6 other troopers randomly selected to fill the ranks at the destination. Even though he was more than angry by getting kicked from his hometown company, he was more upset that he was leaving the town he spent more than one great night in. Although, he did find some comfort in recalling his old dreams. This was destiny. This was Joe's chance to see the front line and do something that mattered. This was his chance to follow in his family's legacy. Then, they arrived. The camp was made of bullet-ridden tents, scrap, trash, pouring sandbags. and an entire company was facing south on an earth and scrap fortified barricade. He saw the troopers getting carted to the dock, those dirty men coming in from patrols, and the 100-yard or raid boys covering their bodies with dirt and mud before going out. Not one of the troopers he saw had a regulation haircut or a proper uniform. Then he saw the not yet familiar horror show of a recovery team pass the trail sentries carting a bag full of exploded human. Trooper Joe wouldn't have known it was a human in the bag if it wasn't for the trail of blood that seeped through the sack and left its mark on the sands. He saw the ridge of crosses in the south, and one of the sentries asked the recovery boys, "Did you see Trooper Bill up there?" The man with the bag said, "Think so. Wish they'd keep him in mercy range." Just then, a trooper on the line of guns shouts an indistinct command, and all the guns blare. The forlorn troopers scatter to their prospective duties during an attack, and Joe leaves the company of those he arrived with to see what was happening. Atop the cliff, he watches a line of red storm across the battered grounds and hack away the men in brown who were part of a mistakenly sent-out wire team. The men in red collapse across the sands as the guns on the line continue to burst. Through the volley, Trooper Joe's trance is cut short by a hand yanking him down, and a dust-covered trooper shouting, "Get the profanity down, you idiot." Legion got guns too. The guns bursting only stopped when the dust settled and there were no standing bodies in red. Not one in the enemy's ranks ran away, and there was more work for the recovery team. The corpses of savage men in masks almost reached the top of the trailhead, and Joe thought about the patrols he went on before moving into the Vegas break. If those raiders of Outer Vegas weren't high on something aggressive, they would have ran away at the first shot he fired. Not this enemy. Stone cold sober. And still they died to the last man in an attempt to kill Joe and this sand-covered band who only slightly resembled the troopers at McCarran. Joe did his best to fit in and tried his best to adapt to the camp. Though scared by the conditions and still missing New Vegas, he held on to that little part of him that wanted this kind of service. He was finally in the thick of it, and at least somewhat proud to be there, at least until that particular vacancy-causing event happened. The camp had much more strict discipline than McCarran, and it wasn't long before his friend he made on the way to Forlorn Hope was put on the 100-yard squad. A slap on the wrist incident at any other station made a coin-flip death sentence at this camp. Trooper Joe's friend was hauled up on a cross on the southern cliffs. Atop the observation line, that cross forever seeped its message into Joe's head. The joking with pals wasn't funny anymore, and none of the stories from them were interesting. Joe was good enough to avoid a camp punishment, but his sadness built up as the days went on. He wrote his will at the advice of camp veterans at the start, but Trooper Joe started writing more and more. He didn't have to write to his favorite girl on the strip. He had a family back home, even a girlfriend. Each night, he'd write, "Dearest sweetheart." That night back when we were kids, or when we were in later schooling, or when we did that simple yet sweet thing was the moment I fell in love with you. Every night I look at your picture and stare into your green, brown, or blue eyes and dream of you, only to reawaken in this horror. Any day now, they're sending me into the no man's land where I may not make it back. If I die, know I'll always be with you and love you forever. To his brother, he writes, "To brother, I never thought you were serious about what you went through at Hoover, but I'm sure that was nothing to what I go through daily. I know your re-enlistment guaranteed you an admin job at some nowhere duty station back in California, but I'm in the worst of it. Things are worse here than the stories can even describe, and those jerks around Nelson aren't sane enough to back off. I didn't imagine this when signing up, so I may not make it out. I love you, bro, but you better avenge me and get off your desk when I die. I'm also sorry about that thing I did to you when we were little." He writes to his mother, "Dear Mom, things are pretty bleak here. I don't think I'm going to survive this one. Every day, there's fewer of us, and those crazies just keep coming. You are the best mom a boy could ever ask for, and I'm sorry for any time I made you upset. You were right. I should have done that thing that would have led to a stabler life. I suppose it's too late for that now. I love you so much, and I'm going to miss you." Dad's letter goes, "Dear Dad, they're sending me out to Nelson soon. I'm not likely to come back from that trip. I was foolish to follow in your footsteps. I suppose I was just a kid trying to be more like his old man, but the Legion keeps hitting us, and any day they're going to call my ticket. I'm sorry, Dad. But know that I am going down fighting. I hope knowing that I'm fighting for what's right in this desert makes you proud." Days, weeks, months, years passed, and Trooper Joe got only sadder and sadder, which was strange because he thought he got over that. Any day now, the Legion was going to overwhelm the line and kill everyone. Any day now, he'd screw up and be sent 100 yards out, or put on a raid squad. Joe began to hate those who seemed fine, continued to joke, or didn't show any emotion at the terrible, awful world around them. The anger, fear, and sadness built up in Joe's mind until he couldn't take it anymore. It occurred to him that he had a lot of leave saved up from his time in service, since he discovered very early that weekend liberty didn't exist for those on the front line. So, he approaches the LT with his question. No, was the answer. Another day on the observation line, the order, send him out, is given, and Joe's rifle jams. The rifle might as well have been held together with bubble gum and cleaned with mud. Joe shouts, "Is there anything more terrible than this?" A dust-covered trooper shouts in a disparaged yet somehow still sarcastic and friendly tone after the volley. "You weren't here for the trench line, kid," and gives a dry chuckle that is despised by every fiber in Joe's body. Later, it occurs to Joe, why are we here? Sitting and waiting, and for what? There has to be something we can do here, or to those at Nelson. The sadness turns almost instantly into an urge to fight that consumes Joe for the longest time. How on earth could Trooper Joe be the only one who wanted to fight while everyone else seemed content with the awfulness? Trooper Joe made his argument known to his pals one day, and he didn't quite understand the response. Everyone there wanted to fight. Everyone there wasn't content with the constant heat and thunder of defensive guns. They were just a little more in touch with the reality. Joe immediately learned that his fantasies of glory in battle were just that, fantasies. Even when Joe reimagined the same things his mom, dad, and brother went through, he only saw what he wanted to. The story. He didn't account for the entire experience leading up to the fantastic moment. However, that only angered Joe. Trooper Joe clung to the story he'd tell his kids and that fantastic moment as if it existed at all. More days, weeks, months, years, or however long went by, and the cocktail of emotions still plagued his mind, making him crave a cocktail. One of his pals back at McCarran smuggled him some smooth liquor. Anything to beat the horrible world around him. It wasn't until after drinking it all that Trooper Joe realized that his tolerance wasn't as high as it was back at McCarran. Trooper Joe took his spot on the night watch drunk as could be, got a 10-day CDL too, and had to join the raid squad every one of those nights. Spirits low, that wasn't the only CDL he got. He just kept getting sent out. A horrible life made worse by the punishment from his own leaders. Something out there kept him alive each time he went out, whether or not the squad encountered red. Punishment after punishment was issued, and Joe was still alive. The sadness, anger, and fear only got worse with each night out in no man's, which he didn't even think was possible. Hardly any ammo, and gun almost broken, Joe sat on the observation line away from those he used to call pals. Dusk was coming, and it wouldn't be long before he had to meet up with the raid squad. He pulled out a cigarette to calm his nerves, and felt for his lighter, but it wasn't in any of his pockets. Did he leave it here, there, or 10 million other places? Did it fall? Was it stolen? Who knew? All Trooper Joe knew was that the one thing he wanted before going into the dangerous night was unattainable because he didn't have his lighter. This was where everything Joe went through fell apart. The planet was exploding, the life he lived went nowhere, and the apocalypse was happening right there and now. Suddenly, the world froze as he heard the words, "Need a light." Trooper Joe's world was put back together in an instant by the dirty trooper, without a dust jacket, handing him a gray steel lighter. Joe accepted it reluctantly, but something washed over him before the calm of nicotine, before even lighting his vice. Trooper Joe lit up, thanked the nameless trooper, and something changed in him. Though he didn't know why, he realized that he wasn't scared, sad, or angry about going out for his punishment. Joe began seeing things he hadn't seen before. Joe actually started seeing when that other trooper handed him a better conditioned rifle for a dangerous task. Trooper Joe saw when his pal on the line gave him a new pair of boots from the care package. That was too big for the owner. He saw it when he lost a game of cards and a nameless trooper said, "Stay away from Corporal Bob. He's a cheat. He also saw it when his abnormally mean sergeant handed him a slice of bacon because Joe was too slow that morning. Trooper Joe was then injured on a raid squad, and Trooper Smith, that scrawny, pale man, used his entire might to drag him back through the sand. Getting patched up with the doc, he knew the concern for him wasn't a side effect of the anesthetic. Back on the line, it was seen when Joe forgot to fill his canteen during morning chow, and that other nameless trooper tossed him his second canteen. As Joe started seeing all these little things, that sadness and rage turned into confusion. Joe couldn't piece together why he was just now seeing all that. Everything was still terrible, but everyone around him was trying to help their pals make things suck even a little bit less. The confusion showed itself in the picture of Joe, and one day, he found himself sitting with his pals he used to keep distant of. On the observation line, his pal, Trooper Bill, saw Joe's mental battle and said, "Cheer up, Joe. Did you forget tonight's the last night of your CDL? No more raid squads for you." Joe found himself mutter, "At least until the next one." That caused a laugh and the gaggle of dirty troopers drenched in Mojave sweat. Joe's response made him laugh as well. Confused by that, he tried to figure out what was funny when the others joked and Trooper Bill said, "Everything'll be fine. Besides, you got Trooper John watching your back out there." Joe took comfort in that, seeing Trooper John for the first real time since Clarity. A man Joe's friends back home would have called Junktown Trash was a muscular beast recently given a raid squad punishment for dropping some crates for the logistics boys. Joe's life was still awful, but Joe realized that Trooper John was headed out there with him that last night. Both of them would crawl through the dirt after being punished by their own commanders, and come back to their pals up top in the morning. Suddenly, that thought, and the whirlwind of confusion he'd been battling for weeks, sorted itself out in Joe's mind. Joe had been so self-involved, so self-pitying, so angry, and so set on glory, that in that moment, he just realized what he'd been seeing since that trooper offered a lighter. Trooper Joe saw all the real glory in the monotonous, frustrated, and coping dirt around him. At that revelation, Joe's world made sense. He hadn't heard from his parents, his brother, or his girlfriend in some time, due to a lockdown, but that didn't matter when he saw his dust-covered pals on the line. Dusk inevitably came, and he gladly stood himself up to join the congregating raid squad with Trooper John. He happily headed down the winding trail with them and marched out into no man's at nightfall with a new personal mantra. "After this, I'm gonna head on back up to camp and turn things around. If I'm making it back for anyone, it ain't for NCR, for my friends back home, or even my family who might as well just be a dream. It's gonna be for my pals up there on the line." The only problem was that Trooper Joe didn't make it back. The raid squad was countered by a Legion night raid. Emerging from the sands, some mask-covered face killed Joe almost instantly with a few well-placed slashes. Joe laid there with the moon high above and his friends dying all around him. The legionary towered over him, looking down at Joe as he rapidly bled out, and Joe had one last thought before leaving this world: "Don't let my body hurt my friends." A recovery team found Joe's body in no man's a few days later, given back during a dust storm, and trapped, of course. The trooper steps forward, looking at the mangled mess that was Joe. The recovery boy asks, "Is that Joe?" "Can't tell," says another trooper, as they use their rods to turn his mutilated body over. The body detonates, but the team is okay from behind the safety of a dune. Once Joe is all collected up, there was no sign that body ever was Joe. The Legion stripped his tags, and the explosion removed every other piece of his identity. It could have been Joe or one of the other fallen. Back up top, the casualty listing from that failed raid confirmed that Joe was at least one of those out there or one on a cross. Joe was gone one way or another. The remains of Joe were buried on that little cliff overlooking the Colorado, no flag and no box. Another man was added to that mass grave, and whether the remains were his or not, a post was added with the inscription: "He didn't deserve that." Trooper Joe understood his world and himself before dying. Joe knew what happened to him would horrify those new to the camp, and knew some sentries would have tried to add a little dead joke upon seeing the recovery boys haul him up. Joe knew the jokes and simple ways of coping with the horror were from minds screaming and crying about the world around them, but were too tough to let show. He knew his place at the camp, and learned about true heroism in the sand around him just in time to enjoy the rest of eternity with his fallen pals on that cliff overlooking the Colorado.